Hello, everyone. What we're going to do this evening is take a look through a few different videos that have been accumulating on my to respond to list. Or, I mean, most of these are things that people have sent to me and suggested, hey, you might want to do a response to this. So I'm like, yes, I will get around to that. And I've decided that now is the time. So this is going to be a little bit of a variety hour, although I think that there is a bit of, topical conformity or consilience to the topics I'm looking at here. They mostly relate to causation in the universe. I'm not exactly sure how many we'll get through. I think there are 3 that I've got to look at. I don't know if we'll get through all of them though before I need to go to bed. So we will see. So sorry if this is a little bit, a little bit maybe disorganized, but I think that hopefully there's a through line here. The first one that we're going to have a look at is this video here by a gentleman I'm not familiar with, Democracy of the Dead. This was just sent to me. I've watched the first part of it, but I haven't watched all of it. And this is a response to a video that I did, would have been about a year ago now, I think, in which Craig sort of partly responded to a question that actually Nathan and I asked about causation and the metaphysics of causation. So we're going to have a little bit of responseception here, because this is kind of me responding to MJ, responding to me, responding to Craig. I may skip past some of my initial remarks and Craig's as well, if I don't think it's the most relevant, because I want to focus mainly on just responding to some of the stuff MJ says. I don't know what MJ says. I'm afraid I don't know his name. Maybe he says it here. No, he does not say in his bio on the bottom, or at least in the description. But anyway, yeah, and just have a bit of a discussion about this, and maybe push the discussion forward. Welcome everyone, David, Oscar, and Mitch. Thanks for joining us. So we'll see how we go. Let's make a start. Let's hang on. Let's just set the speed 1.5 and let's go.
Beep, beep, beep. Look at the awesome graphics behind me. Oh my goodness. So I am going to be a black shadow today because of the way my computer is set up. Sorry about that. Couple of announcements. Hopefully you can hear me. Chris may join later. Going to Japan and leaving this house next week. So I will be probably offline until, let's see, late August, early September. So I'll miss you guys. But okay, that's the main. Or I might pop in and do like different things for my phone, maybe. Who knows? Maybe I'll try to do that with my GoPro. Anyway, this is a video some people requested I respond to Fodor. I just brought up this random one because it was kind of shorter. It's 33 minutes long. I might not get through all of it, but it's entitled Craig Responds About the Causal Principle and Fails to Answer the Question. Of course, he got these stupid titles. I don't know. But maybe he does fail. I don't know, whatever. So we'll determine whether or not I'm convinced he failed to answer the question, or that Fodor failed to understand what Craig said. So let's just go. Let's just play this sucker and go. These stupid titles are so annoying sometimes. Let's see. Let's keep going with that.
Put a link to the description in this one. And one of those, it seems Craig has responded to. Nathan is mentioned by name, so I'm assuming that he submitted this to Unbelievable. But anyway, let's first listen to Craig's response, and then I will provide a response to that response.
Atheistic, deterministic, nihilistic views like Greens.
And now I'm providing a response to that response to the response. It gets a bit silly. I much prefer to actually, talk through this in person with people. But sometimes, sometimes this is what you get. So that's what we're doing today.
We've got another question that sort of links in, and obviously this is going back to your well-established work on the Kalam cosmological argument. And I know you've answered this question a number of times, but Nathan asks it, and I think it's helpful to remind ourselves on how you respond. Firstly, he says,
why is it so fast? Hold on a second. Does he have it sped up?
Yes.
Can't the universe just begin without a cause? And secondly, it causes our relationships between spatio-temporal events. Why would the universe, which is not a spatio-temporal event, need a cause? This, of course, just to set the scene, is obviously related to the Kalam cosmological argument, in which you say anything which begins to exist has a cause.
Now, there is a distinction between view. By the way, Fodor's going to bring up an article that he says Craig's scared to look at or something like that. I forget his words. But we at Democracy of the Dead have brought up this article numerous times when we talk about simultaneous causation or the causal theory of time and all that stuff, and how it pertains to the first premise and all that stuff. So one view is causation is a relationship between spatio-temporal events. Another view is theory of causation, according to which they're just a relationship between events. It doesn't need to be spatio-temporal events. It could just be a relationship between events, which I think is the better view. But we'll see where Fodor goes.
Yeah, so that's going to be, I think, the main contention, at least for the first half or so of the video that I've seen. One thing that I want to mention is what the question is, right, that I originally asked, or Nathan and I originally asked of Craig, which is, if causation is a relationship between spatio-temporal events, then how can the universe have a cause? I mean, the idea is that it sort of can't, right? If the beginning of the universe is the first spatio-temporal event, then there can't be an antecedent one that is the cause for that. So I claim that Craig didn't answer the question because he just said he doesn't see any reason to accept the view that causation is a relationship between spatio-temporal events. And that doesn't answer the question, right, as to if it is that, then what would follow for the Kalam. And the point of that is, I think that simply if the view holds, that is, if causation is a relationship between spatial temporal events, then I think the Kalam can't succeed, or at least it has to find a way around that, which Craig doesn't really discuss, at least not that I'm aware of. And I think it seems from what Democracy of the Dead, or MJ, says here, that he agrees with that the Kalam doesn't succeed, or at least Craig's version of the Kalam doesn't succeed if you accept that causation is a relationship between spatial temporal events. So in that sense, it seems that we're actually in agreement, although, so I don't know why MJ is sort of, we'll see, he sort of seems to disagree with me in the first part, even though I feel like that we agree. So I'm not entirely sure if I've misunderstood something there, but what I want to emphasize is that I think Craig did fail to answer the question, because the question is a conditional. If this view were true, what would that mean for the Kalam? And then if you just say, I don't think there's any reason to think that the view is true, that doesn't answer the question. Yeah, think about this. If someone asks you, look, if you were to go to the shops, what would you buy? And you say, I'm not planning on going to the shops. That doesn't answer the question, does it? You've dodged the question. And so similarly, I think Craig dodged the question here, whether deliberately or just wasn't really listening to the wording. That's kind of irrelevant. But so that was the key point there. And I think I was reasonably clear in the video. I mean, maybe I could have been clearer, right? But anyway, so that's what I was getting at with the title and wanted to try to make clear. So we'll see that MJ takes issue with how I phrase it. But I think it was a fair presentation that Craig didn't answer that question. Anyway, let's keep going.
The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and then you give reasons why that cause is best explained as God. But to sum up again this question, why couldn't the universe just begin to exist without a cause? And what about the fact that it doesn't seem to have the same kind of properties as other causes which are spatiotemporal?
So just to clarify here, although Craig has said before about why he thinks that everything begins to exist needs a cause, the question was asked following our response to what he said before. So obviously that is too long to put into that question. So unfortunately, he's just going to repeat all of what he said before. But the interesting part is the second part of the question, which is about the idea that if causation is a relationship between
Yeah, David, I tend to speed up videos when I watch them for a response to save a bit of time, and also because I think a lot of you may have seen the original video here. But that does lead to the issue that if everyone speeds up their responses to videos that are then sped up, you get this exponential increase in the speed of the videos. Yes, anyway, hopefully that shouldn't be too much of an issue here. If it is, let me know. Yes, Skeptic mentions, how can you have events that are non-spatiotemporal? Well, that's an interesting question. Hopefully he'll expand on that further. Oh, I was excited to hear that he's actually discussed that specific article, the Stanford Encyclopedia one that I brought up, because I think those are really good articles, and so it's good to be engaging with the good material.
Spatiotemporal events, and
if that's the case, yeah. If so,
yeah,
Craig's going to say,
so that's the question
for that view.
No, so this is unfair, right? It's perfectly legitimate to ask, under a certain view, like if the view were true, what would follow from that? Like that's how Craig phrases his arguments. Think about the moral argument. If God did not exist, then objective moral value would not exist. Objective moral value does exist, therefore God exists, or something to that effect. Maybe the wording is slightly different, but the point is it's a conditional. It's perfectly valid to do that. And I think that this is where MJ goes wrong. He says, look, Craig doesn't have to accept the view without that causes a relationship between spatiotemporal events without an argument given. And I think that's fine. Like Craig doesn't have to accept the view, but what we should do is answer the question of the hypothetical, or if he thinks the hypothetical is unfair, then he can say that. But he did neither of those. He, in my view, dodged the question. I don't see what's wrong with asking, look, under this view, how would this argument work, or would the argument work? And that's that's the whole point of the question. And MJ seems to agree with me here that Craig's argument doesn't work under this view. And the relevance of that is for someone who accepts, as I lean to, and I think a lot of philosophers here, as I argue, that causation is a relation between spatiotemporal events, then the Kalam will not be persuasive for them unless they get an argument for why that view about causation is false, which Craig doesn't provide. So holding that view about causation will act as a defeater for whatever arguments Craig will give for the Kalam. That's the point of this question I was asking. That's what I was trying to draw out with the question. And that's why I felt Craig failed to answer the question, because he doesn't really deal with that. He just says, why accept that view? Craig may not accept that view. MJ may not accept that view. But if I accept that view, if other people accept that view, they won't be persuaded by the Kalam. So if the Kalam is to succeed as a philosophical argument, if it's to succeed as an apologetic, it, I think, should have resources to deal with people who hold, I think, that quite reasonable view about causation. That's the whole thrust of this question.
I don't think it's a stupid question, but
of course, the very first spatial temporal event, like at the start of the universe, wouldn't have had any spatial temporal event before that. So you couldn't even have a causal relationship existing there. So if if that analysis is correct, then why would we expect that everything that begins to exist has a cause?
Or there's a causal relationship there, and therefore the theory of causation that construes causation in terms of two spatio-temporal events is therefore wrong. So your modus ponens is our modus tollens.
That's typically why would the universe have a cause? I've never heard.
Yeah, but that's my point, MJ. That's exactly my point. The point of this question is not to prove that the proponent of the Kalam has an incorrect conception of causation. The point of this question is to illustrate that for those who have a particular view of causation, again, what I would argue is a plausible and widely held view, they will not be persuaded by the Kalam absent further reasons as to why they should reject that view. MJ seems to think that by asking this question, I've challenged the proponent of the Kalam to show why they reject this view. I mean, I guess maybe there's a little bit of that, but mostly it's really just challenging them to actually provide arguments that will be persuasive to those who hold a view like this, rather than simply ignoring the issue, which I think Craig mostly does, because he doesn't talk much about philosophy of causation, or at least I've not heard him talk much about it. I've read a few remarks that he's made on the subject, but very little about this particular issue.
Heard Craig respond to that, so it's interesting to hear what he has to say. So I'll let Craig respond in full, and then I will comment on his response.
The second point first, I think it's an unjustified assumption to say that causality only holds between spatio-temporal events. I can't imagine what an argument for that assumption would look like, and so I think that is an unjustified assumption. Now, with respect to the causal premise of the argument, in my published work, I've given three
let's skip this part.
So that's literally all Craig said. He said, I can't even imagine what an argument for that would look like, that being that causation is a relation between spatio-temporal events. He can't even imagine what an argument for that would look like, and therefore it's an unjustified assumption. Even if that's true, the question is, if it were true, what would follow? So Craig could simply say, look, I think that's an unjustified assumption, but if it were true, and then he can say whatever. He can say it would contradict his argument or it wouldn't, right? That would be answering the question. And so, like, for example, you could ask, look, what if Jesus's disciples actually did hallucinate him? Then you could say, would Christianity be true? And a Christian could say, look, I don't think that happened, but if it were the case that they hallucinated him, then, I guess maybe Christianity wouldn't be true. Or maybe it still would be, right? I mean, maybe they hold a different view about that sort of thing. The point is, it's perfectly legitimate to ask these questions to understand someone else's view and to see what implications different positions would have. For example, suppose the tomb wasn't empty. Suppose there was actually a body there, or suppose they went to the wrong tomb. What implications would that have? Suppose Paul didn't write this or that epistle. What implications would that have? The Christian doesn't have to accept the antecedents to that question for them to provide a meaningful and useful answer to it, for us to gain in the dialogue, right? That's the point of questions like this. And that's why Craig failed to answer the question, in my view, because he just dodged it and said he doesn't think the antecedent is correct, even though many other people do, right? And so, well, what if you do? Like, Craig, what do you say to people who do think that causation is a relation between antecedent, between spatio-temporal events? That's what the question was trying to get at. And Craig didn't tell me what he thinks that such people should do. And that's sort of the whole point.
So he's going to give the three arguments. I'm not going to go to Blackwell Companion, go to a bunch of different parts on reasonable faith. He'll go over the three arguments he has for why the first premise of Kalam is more plausible than its denial. So
yeah, that's fine. But not want to talk about that here. That's not the most important of this video anyway.
I think to consider.
I have a follow-up question, but more.
Okay, so that's all he has to say about that. It's a brief response. So as you can see, he first responds to the second part of the question, which is about the idea that causation is relationship between spatio-temporal events, and then he just goes through his standard reasons for thinking that everything that begins to exist has a cause. So let's talk about the second part first, as Craig does. And what he says is just that, maybe we'll actually show Craig. What he actually says is that that's an unjustified assumption. He says he can't think of any reason why we would think that a causation is a relationship between spatio-temporal events. Now, this is a very...
Well, that's half of it. He doesn't see a reason why it's the case, but he also said that it would be nice if we had an argument for the view. And I think where Fodor is going to go here is that it's a possible view. And so therefore, the onus is on Craig to invalidate that possibility, to address the possibility, to address certain reasons that might be floating out there for and against the possibility. I mean, that's controversial. I think that the person that's proposing that theory needs to provide an argument for it if they're purposely trying to undercut or rebut the first premise of the Kalam, using this theory of causation. Let's see where Fodor goes, because I might have forgotten.
Interesting response. For a number of reasons. First of all, it seems, although he doesn't explicitly say this, it seems, given what he did say and what he didn't say, that Craig is tacitly admitting that if causation was a relationship between spatio-temporal events in space and time, then that would undermine the causal principle, right? Because again, if causation is a relationship between two events in space and time that connects them together in a causal manner, then the very first event that occurs at the beginning of the universe wouldn't have any prior.
I don't see why this is news or why this assumption needs to be tacit, all this stuff. Look, I mean, if you look at the inferences that you have to make from the nature of the cause in the conclusion, the way the cause is serving in the conclusion, and the properties that cause has to have, if it's timeless and spaceless, and that's everywhere in Craig's printed work on this topic, then of course it's going to exclude theories of causation that construe causation in terms of a relationship between spatio-temporal events. If the cause is spatio-temporal, then that's going to contradict the properties that Craig inferred about the cause and the conclusion about it being spaceless and causeless. I don't see why this is news.
Spatio-temporal event.
Yeah, so this is what I said before. So MJ agrees with me that, in fact, a view of causation as a relation between spatio-temporal events is contradicts the Kalam, right? So you can't hold that that's all of what causation is. As he says later, you can think that causation often is that, but you can't think that encompasses all of what causation is, and agree with the Kalam, right? Or agree with all the premises of the Kalam, which is the whole point of the question that I asked. So in some sense, I feel like we could just stop here, right? Because that was the point I was attempting to illustrate with this, with the original video. Obviously, there's more to talk about, right? But I just think it's, I mean, I thought I was fairly clear in the original video about that was the point I was trying to make, that there's a plausible view of causation that many philosophers hold. You don't have to hold it. Craig doesn't have to hold it, but many people do hold it. And Craig's Kalam argument will not be persuasive to the people who hold this view. When I asked Craig about this, through Nathan's question, welcome Nathan, by the way, in chat. When I asked Craig about this, he didn't address this point that his argument will not be persuasive to such people. He simply said, look, there's no reason for me to accept such a view, which is dodging the question, right? Because it's perfectly reasonable to ask, well, what about this view, right? And I don't really see what the problem with asking that sort of question is. I don't think it's shifting the burden of proof, because Craig's the one making the argument to say, hey, look, my premises are true. And if I say, hey, look, here's a condition where your premises are not true, I'm not sure why I have to then prove that that condition holds, or give a strong argument. All I have to do is raise that as a possibility. And then, insofar as I've done that, I feel like I can just say, well, look, if I hold this view, then I'm not persuaded by your argument. I guess this comes down to what you think burden of proof is, and how the discussion works sort of philosophically. I mean, in some sense, no one has the burden of proof, right? If you hold a view and I hold a different view, then neither of us have to persuade each other. I guess the issue is, if Craig wants his apologetic for the Kalam to be persuasive to people who hold a view about causation that I do, about it being a relation between spatial temporal events, then he's going to need to say something about this, other than simply saying he doesn't agree with the view. And that's, burden of proof aside, I think that's really the issue here. And Craig had the opportunity to do this in responding to this question, and he didn't. He just dodged it. That's my criticism of him.
By definition.
Okay.
And so there's simply no possibility of it standing in a causal relationship, at least as the effect of any prior cause. It could be the cause of the subsequent event, but it couldn't be the effect of any prior cause, right? So Craig seems to be admitting here, because he didn't dispute this point, and he just then tried to whack down the notion itself. So it seems that he's...
You mean whack down the notion itself? What he's asking for is an argument for the view. That's not whacking down the notion itself.
Yeah, because it's whacking down the notion itself because he refused to engage with it as a possibility, as a conditional, right? If the view were true, what would follow? He didn't engage with that. And again, I just gave some examples of a perfectly legitimate question. If this view were true, what would follow? If this view were true, what would you expect? Or what would that imply for your argument? I don't see what the problem with that is. If you just ignore that and say, I don't think that's true, then in a sense that's whacking it down. Or I mean, that's maybe not the best way to put it, but it's dodging the question, I think, is a good way to put it. So I think I stand by what I said. He dodged the question.
Is it? Whacking down the notion itself, he's asking for a proponent of the argument just to give us an argument for the view. And if there's a good argument for the view, the premise is more plausible than its denial, then you might have a good reason to give up the first premise of the Kalam. Okay.
Tacitly admitting.
Yeah, so again, MJ just seems to agree with exactly what I'm saying. If you think you have a good argument, or if you have good reason to hold this particular view of causation, then you're not going to accept the relevant premise of the Kalam. What does Craig have to say to such a person? That is my question, right? If he responds by saying Craig is not persuaded by this view, that doesn't, that's not an answer. Obviously, Craig's not going to be persuaded by the view. The question is, what does he have to say to those who are? I mean, imagine a Christian comes up to you and says, hey, look, the Bible says that you should believe in Jesus and be saved, and, repent and all this stuff. And you say, well, I don't believe the Bible. I don't believe the Bible is the word of God. And then the Christian says, what are you talking about? Like, prove to me that it's not true. And you're just saying, well, look, you're telling me that I should do this thing, or I should believe this thing. I'm just telling you that I don't agree with this premise. If you believe the Bible, then you should repent. Well, I don't believe in the Bible. Like, what if I don't? That's all that's happening here. I'm just sort of raising with Greg, hey, I and a lot of other people don't accept this key premise that you kind of tacitly assume that this theory of causation is wrong about, spatial temporal events. What about us? Like, what are you going to say to us? And if he just says, we're wrong, like, we're not going to be persuaded by the argument, right? That is the whole point. I feel like I'm repeating myself at this point, but I don't know. I think that this is I think that I'm making a fair criticism here of Craig's strategy of not dealing with this.
That if this analysis is correct, then that does undermine the causal principle. So I think that's actually quite an interesting tacit admission. Now, if that's an incorrect reading, Craig can correct.
No, it's a correct reading, and it's not an interesting admission. It's old news. That theory of causation is incompatible with the properties you infer about the cause, as the cause is functioning in the conclusion. That's just, we've known this since the 70s, probably.
Correct me here, but it just given that he could have said, well, it doesn't matter if that's true. The cause.
Daniel, I feel like Fodor might be in need of a taxi cab. Schopenhauer, taxi cab fallacy. I mean, I don't know. We'll see. I was going to say something that totally left my mind in a.
And why, but he didn't do that. That would have been a stronger claim, right? Because then it doesn't matter if it's true. But he actually just said, well, there's no reason to think that it is true. So I think that's a tacit admission that this notion or understanding of causation would undermine the causal principle. Okay, so that's the first thing that's interesting. I think the second interesting point is the reason he gave for not accepting this analysis of causation. He simply said, I can't think of any reason why we would accept that. Well, that's not a very satisfactory response, because remember, this is part of an argument that Craig's advancing for the contention that the universe had cause, and ultimately that cause being God. But one of the key premises here, the causal premise, is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. There's slightly different ways that Craig's formulated.
If there's no good reason to accept a view, why consider it? That doesn't mean the view is false, but there's no reason to include it in a consideration for why it might undercut premise one, construed in terms of other theories of causation, right? Why would he want to consider a view for which he can see no good reason to accept? Oh, it's on my...
Well, this is interesting, right? So Craig thinks there's no good reason to be an atheist. So why would he want to respond to views that atheists have? Well, because he's trying to persuade atheists, or at least persuade people to not be atheists. I suppose we've talked before about exactly who Craig is appealing to. So I just think that this is a really odd thing for MJ to say here. I find, I mean, I don't want to be rude, I don't know him, but I find some of his comments very defensive, in the sense of, like, you know, he seems to want to say, look, unless you've proven me wrong, I can go on holding the beliefs that I have. We'll sort of see, I think, some of this come across. I find that approach, I mean, he's not alone in taking that approach. Plenty of people do. I find it very off-putting. I think the relevant question is, what views are the best views? Like, which views have the best evidence and arguments in favor of them? If we're interested in philosophy, if we're lovers of wisdom, right, then we'll seek out the best reasons and evidences available to us, not simply get defensive and say, well, you haven't shown that my view is false. So with respect to Craig here, if Craig is interested in discoursing with, dialoguing, and ultimately providing a convincing apologetic to atheists, not-theist philosophers, then it behooves him to at least have something to say to those who accept this, again, widely accepted, not universal, but at least widely accepted theory of causation. And that's the whole point. What does he have to say to such people? He can ignore it if he wants to. That's Craig's, Craig's business. And if he doesn't think there are good views, good reasons for it, then he's entitled to think that, right? And it's not as if, we can say that he must consider the view. But if he's trying to do an apologetic, and this is a view that blocks people from accepting his argument, then why wouldn't he respond to it? I don't quite understand. It's like MJ's defensiveness about, oh, why should you respond to it? Well, because it's a popular view that is in contrast to what Craig is trying to persuade people of. So isn't that a good enough reason to respond to it? Even if Craig doesn't find it persuasive. Again, Craig doesn't find any arguments for atheism persuasive, but he responds to a lot of them. But he hasn't responded to this issue. That's the point I'm making here.
Damn, got it. That was the fly I've been trying to kill all night. So you see, he sees no good reason for why to even consider the view. So he's asking the people that are proponents of the view to provide an argument for why the view is true, and therefore he would have good reason to accept that theory of causation, and therefore probably consider it when he's going over the pros and cons of how premise one fits in with that theory or is incompatible with that theory. What's up, Irene? Right. The only issue for Craig, oh, sorry, I can do this. Yeah. The only issue for Craig is being a Christian.
Analysis of causation under which that fails, namely the view that I've just mentioned, the idea that causation is a relationship between space and time.
Oh yeah, and another thing, Craig doesn't think God's timeless. Okay, one month.
Action to Craig's argument, right? So the thing is that even if we don't have any particular reason for thinking that that view is true, if that's a possibility, Craig needs to respond to it, because he's making a deductive argument. He's trying to defend this premise.
I totally disagree. Just because he's making a deductive argument and it's a premise in there, Craig is under no obligation to consider views for which he sees no good reason to accept. And if this view is proposed to him in a letter written by James and Nathan that uses this theory of causation, according to which causation is a relationship between two spatiotemporal events, you're going to need to provide an argument for why that's the case. And I guess later on he's going to go to this SCP article where they're going to discuss this as a possible theory of causation. And the thing is about this theory of causation is that you can endorse this, and you can endorse it in certain like spatiotemporal contexts. You can just say,
yeah. So he's saying you can endorse it in some context. We'll come to that later, but I think, yeah, I would, if I was redoing this video, I would probably moderate what I said there, just because saying that Craig has to discuss this issue or has an obligation to, I forget what I said earlier, but so that I think is presupposing a particular theory of like normative discourse about what you have to and should not say. So that may have been too strong, but I would say that Craig should, in some sense, in the sense that if he wants to be persuasive to people who don't hold his view, like given that is his objective, then he should say something about this, particularly when that's put in front of him and he's given an opportunity to respond. Just like, if you're a Christian talking to a Muslim, for example, and you want to try to persuade them why they should accept Christianity or at least seriously consider it, and they tell you they believe that, Muhammad was the last and greatest prophet and Jesus is not the son of, or not, the son of God or not God incarnate or whatever. If the Christian would just respond to that and say, well, I don't see any reason to accept anything that you've said. Why should I respond to you? Like, that's just not engaging in discourse. That is not loving wisdom, I would argue. That's not wanting to have a genuine conversation with someone. That's just intellectual defensiveness. So yeah, look, Craig doesn't have to respond to any view that he doesn't want to or doesn't take seriously. I guess the question would be, why wouldn't he? Given that there are smart people who endorse this view, and it does seem very relevant to an argument that he spent a lot of his career defending. So why can't we have a discussion about it? I invited Craig to respond to it in this question here, and all he said was, I don't see any reason to think that view is true. Even that, like he personally doesn't have to think there's any reason, but he could say, look, here are some reasons that people have given to think that that view is true. Here's why I don't think they're good. That would be better than just saying, I don't think that there's any good reason to think that it's true. He could say, look, I don't think there's good reason to think that view is true. If it were true, here's what would follow. But, I don't think it's true, so it doesn't matter, or maybe it doesn't matter anyway because he's got a way around it, right? That would be moving the discourse forward. That would be enlightening. I would have learned something, right? We would have made progress. We would have learned together. But instead, we got a defensive, evasive response. And I feel like MJ is just sort of saying, that's fine. Well, in a sense, it's fine in that Craig can say whatever he likes. But what sort of discourse do we want to model? What are we trying to do here? What is Craig trying to do in his apologetics? And I think that, given plausible answers to these questions, Craig's answer just isn't satisfactory. And that's the point. Again, that's the point I'm trying to make here.
Say, look, maybe it's not a necessary theory. Maybe after the first moment of time, this theory of causation holds when under certain descriptions that fall under cases where you have a relationship between spatiotemporal events. And maybe you can do that, but you just can't do it for the first event. Is that ad hoc? No, because of the nature of the cause, what the nature of the cause has to be.
Yeah, so maybe I think we'll get into more about that later. But what's disappointing is that Craig didn't say that, right? MJ's telling this, and I mean, Craig may endorse that or not, I don't know. But why couldn't Craig have said those things instead of just saying, I don't see any reason to accept that view? Why couldn't we get an exploration of the view instead of just a dodge?
To be the cause of all space, time, matter, and energy. And so after that first event gets going, then maybe you could have this theory of causation. And that's a non-ad hoc, non-arbitrary reason for why that first event isn't subject to that theory. There's all kind of different directions you can go here. This isn't some kind of checkmate move or interesting move to make. But anyway, I disagree with that completely. That being a protocol, you have to consider every possibility, every possible theory, and how it might relate to your premise, even if you have absolutely no good reason to think that theory is true at all, and you're just.
So what I would say normatively in terms of the norms that I would endorse for the discourse, if you're making a philosophical argument, what you should consider are major serious philosophical objections that could be and are levied against that position that would be relevant. So not every single possible one. I don't know if I said that. If I did, I would say that would be an overreach. Obviously, every single possible one would be infinitely large, right? That would be unreasonable. But major ones that are widely held, that are relevant, yeah, you should consider those in terms of norms of the discourse. Now, Craig doesn't have to, of course. He can do what he likes, right? But in terms of if you're doing good philosophy, if you're doing good apologetic, yeah, you should. Just as if you're saying Christianity is the only true religion, you might not have any reason to think the others are true, but I think you should, if you're making an apologetic for that, have something to say about the other world religions, the other major ones, something to say about them to their adherents and well, why you don't think that their claims are plausible or as plausible. If you're advocating for a theory of mind, you should have something to say about the other main theories of mind or a theory of metaethics. The view that MJ is staking would almost seem consistent with the idea that you make up your mind and then just bury your head in the sand and say, look, I'm not going to consider your view because I don't see any reason to accept it. And you're just going to end up, if you take that to the nth degree, in an intellectual silo where you never consider any other view because you don't consider it to be plausible. And of course, you're not going to consider it to be plausible if you never listen to any arguments for it, are you? Now, MJ didn't say that, right? But that's what I'm arguing for, is why I don't think that the norm that he seems to be endorsing there is a good one. Yeah, Craig should, normatively speaking, in terms of doing good philosophy, engage with serious views that would disrupt or conflict with his position, especially when he's called out, called up on it specifically, as I did in this question, and had the opportunity to do that. And it's bad, like normatively speaking, in terms of doing philosophy, having a discourse, learning from each other. It's bad that he did not do that and instead dodged.
Just asking people to provide an argument for it. I don't think you need to propose that stuff or consider that stuff. But the thing is, if you propose an argument for why that's a metaphysically necessary theory in every explanatory context or every metaphysical context, I'm pretty sure Craig isn't going to cower in a corner. He's going to address the argument, and then we can have the conversation. That's it.
But why couldn't he just do that here? That's what I'm saying. Why does he have to? Why is he putting all the burden on people who disagree with him to then come up with reasons, which Craig could access, right? It's not like I am the philosopher who has to provide him with these reasons. They're well known and discussed in the literature, as MJ is about to tell us. So I'm not expecting Craig to cower in a corner. I'm hoping that he'll just give a response, but he didn't, right? So why can't we just have that discussion now? I mean, I have cynical reasons for thinking why Craig didn't do this, right? Because it gets messy, right? And it's hard to defend his view. Of course, there are things you can say on it, right? But it's not going to be as persuasive to people, most of the people watching, as to just say, why accept the view? That's why I think he didn't do it, not because he has nothing else to say. It's just that whatever he did say, I think he would have regarded as less less persuasive to the key audience that he's trying to reach. Let me say it
the
that
causal
way.
principle holds. If there's a potential refuter to that, which, as I've argued, he seems to implicitly admit that is a potential defeater, he needs to show that that's false if we're to accept his argument.
You really need to show that something's false if someone hasn't provided an argument for why it's true. Do you really need to do that? I don't feel like you need to do that. I feel like the person that proposes that theory needs
I've
to
already
be
discussed that.
justified in believing in the external world, justified in believing in the not.
Move forward.
I don't agree with that protocol.
To that, I guess if we're to regard his argument as persuasive. So suppose that I hold to that view.
Yeah. So just a footnote on that. I think the original way I presented that was a bit too strong, and I would nuance that slightly. But I think the overall point is sound. So I think MJ had, I think he was onto something with the strength I made that point with. But I think overall the thrust of what I'm saying was fine, was fair.
Which actually, as I'll argue later, I think we have some reason to think is correct.
Okay, there you go. He says he'll argue later. He has some good reason to think that that's the correct theory. And then write another letter of reasonable faith, and Craig will probably respond to your reasons for why you think that theory is true. And then you have a dialogue about it.
That's causation.
Well, why couldn't he just respond now? It's not like Craig has access to anything that I would say on this, right? It's not like I'm a novel thinker about metaphysics of causation. Perhaps one day I will be, if I can get some time to work on that, because I think it's actually very interesting. But this is what I don't understand. It's like, well, write another letter where you actually give some reasons, and then Craig will respond to you. I mean, I don't see why he would, right? He's not responded to my book or to other questions that we put forward to him or other videos we've done. This is the only thing he's responded to directly, I think. Maybe there was one other brief thing. And he just dodged. Why wouldn't he just dodge again, right? He'll just say, oh, see, here's the issue. Suppose I give an argument for why this theory of causation is true, and there's a premise in that argument. Craig's going to say, I don't have any reason to accept that premise. and then I'll have to write another letter giving reasons for that premise, right? And then if someone doesn't want to engage with you, they just won't engage with you. They'll just say, I don't see any reason to accept that premise, and end the discussion there. That's not honest, open engagement, right? And this is the problem. If Craig's going to dodge this question here, he's going to dodge anything else, I would say, as well, likely as not, it seems to me. So I don't really see why MJ's advice would change much of anything on this point.
Is a relationship between spatiotemporal events. If I hold to that, and then Craig just tells me, well, there's no reason to think it.
He wouldn't say there isn't a reason to think it if you provided a reason for why you think it's true. He would say that your reason is probably bad for these other reasons or something like that. What are you talking about? Am I not following this guy? Chat, help me. Am I not following him? If he provides a reason to Craig can no longer say that there isn't in existence a reason for why the theory is true.
Yeah, of course
he's doing exactly what Craig.
Of course he could, because he could just reject one of the premises that I used, right? And unless you're actually going to say, look, here's my view, here's your view, let's compare them and actually have a discussion. If you're just going to say, I don't have any reason to believe this premise, well, then you're never going to have a discussion, right? Because you can always find that. That's the problem with, I think, pursuing MJ's recommendation here. And again, it's very defensive. It's like you're not actually wanting to have a discussion. You just want to have something to say to the person who disagrees with you. And like, who cares? Because you could just ignore people, Suppose someone gives you an argument you don't agree with. Like, you just ignore them. You don't have to have something to respond to if you don't actually care. But if you do care, and you do care about wisdom, and you do want to learn about, and you do want to engage with other people, well, then let's have something more substantive to say than just, I don't agree with you, which is basically all that Craig's doing at this point.
Craig asked Voter to do at the beginning of the video, which is provide an argument for the view. That's all that's going on here. This is so weird.
Remember what my question was? My question was, if this view about causation is true, then what would follow for the Kalam? I don't see why I need to show that the view is true for that to be a useful, important, valid question. Craig is dodging it by saying, show that the view is true. So I just want to highlight that, because that was the whole point of this video, not to show that the view is true, but to raise it as a serious question, which I think it is. And Craig is dodging if he then requires me to show that it is true. And of course, suppose I gave some arguments for it, well, then he'd just question one of those premises, and we'd keep in the dodging cycle. So I don't think that would really help.
All right.
And therefore, I'm not going to think that that's true, and therefore Craig is not going to respond to this idea.
So he thinks that those reasons
a
are
little
bit.
bit.
In fact, that's not all he would do if he
I do think that it's a reason.
Properties that you infer for the cause.
It's very hard for me to understand how Craig could not even conceive of a reason for thinking that this is true.
It's very easy to come up with a reason for why this thing is not metaphysically necessarily true. Because the properties that you infer for the cause in the conclusion of the Kalam cosmological argument are properties that are incompatible with the theory. And so if the argument goes through, the premise needs to be construed in a particular way. So if the cause necessarily is inferred from the first two premises of the Kalam, and this cause has to have these certain properties that have been spaceless and timeless prior to creation, then you can't have a theory of causation according to which causation is necessarily a relationship between two events that are spatiotemporal. It's impossible.
Saying that he has to agree that this is.
So this is another instance where MJ agrees with me, or agrees with the thrust of the question that I was making, that this notion of causation, being a relation between spatiotemporal events, cannot coexist with the Kalam as Craig presents it. So he agrees with that. So the first thing, as I said before, why doesn't Craig come out and say that? If that's so clear and obvious as MJ says, that would have been helpful, would have moved the discussion forward. But the second point then is the reason he gave is very interesting, because he's essentially said, look, well, if you agree with the conclusion of or if you agree with the premises and conclusion of the Kalam, then obviously causation can't be a relation between spatial-time events, because it doesn't work under the Kalam. And well, yes, that was my point, right? So what if you don't think that? What if you don't think that what if you think that causation is a relation between spatial-temporal events? Well, then you're never going to accept the Kalam, are you? And that was my point. See, MJ is thinking, it seems to me, he's thinking from the perspective of someone who broadly agrees with Craig, at least about the Kalam. And he's thinking, what could they say? And he's thinking, well, they could just reject the idea that causation is a spatial-temporal relation between events, at least necessarily, right? Because obviously it has to be if the Kalam is to work. And yes, of course they can do that. That isn't the point of the question at all. That's just like saying, well, what does a Christian do when they talk to the Muslim? Well, they can just deny that the Quran is revealed from God. Of course they can do that, right? But the point is, what about the person who doesn't agree with Craig, who thinks that causation in this instance is a relation between spatial-temporal events, or leans to that view? What's Craig going to have to say that's going to convince them that they're wrong? What reasons does he have to provide, that Craig provide, that the person should change their mind? If Craig doesn't have anything to say to that view, then the person won't have reason to change their mind. And like MJ says, that they therefore won't be persuaded by Craig's argument. And so is the point of the argument to try to change people's minds, or at least move the dialogue forward to help us understand the world better, to learn new things? Or is it just to put up these barriers so that you can give reasons to why you don't have to change your mind when someone disagrees with you? I think it should be the former, right? I think we should be trying to seek reasons, which is why it was disappointing for Craig to dodge. But MJ, I'm not sure. He almost seems to be saying that it doesn't really matter what the atheist thinks, or the person who doesn't agree with the Kalam. It's all about what the Kalam adherent thinks. And if they can have a way of avoiding this problem, then that's all that matters. But again, like, if you don't agree with the atheist or the skeptic about the Kalam, you could just not talk to them, right? Like, you don't have to have anything to say to them. And that's not the point of my question at all. The question is, if we want to actually talk about this together, then what does the proponent of the Kalam have to say to me or others about this particular point?
It's true, right? I'm not convinced that this analysis is true, but surely you can at least think of a possible reason for thinking that it's true, right? And this is where I want to talk a little bit about the philosophy of causation. Of course, I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not an expert.
He's not a philosopher? What is he? I thought he was a philosopher. He's not an expert. But anyway, he's about to bring up the SCP article that we brought up on the show so many times. The Metaphysics of Causation article in SCP, which I would bet, I lost all kind of money when I bet last time with TJ. I would bet 1,000 cents that Craig is aware of the article in SCP called the Metaphysics of Causation. I'm pretty sure he's aware of it. But anyway.
Now, that was an interesting comment. He's pretty sure that Craig is aware of the SCP article on causation. I'm extremely confident that Craig is aware of this article as well. I mean, why did MJ say this? Did he think that I thought that Craig wasn't aware of the point? Does it matter whether Craig was aware of it or not? Like, the point is, let's discuss the issues that are raised on this article. And I use this article because it's, I think, an authoritative and useful, accessible, well, reasonably accessible article discussing some of these issues that is also free to access, right? So you can go and look at it yourself, unlike a lot of other sources. Whether Craig has read it or aware of it, which I assume he is, but regardless, isn't the point. The point is, let's discuss the issues here. It's not a gotcha, right? It's not supposed to be a gotcha. I would like Craig to answer the question, and I do put it forward in a way that invites rigorous engagement. But that's not the same as a gotcha. That's like, look, here's this issue. What's your response? Let's talk about it. It's not like, I just don't really understand. Again, I feel like defensiveness is coming through. Like, well, he's heard about it before. Do you really think he hasn't heard about it? Well, I assume he has, but he didn't say anything about it, right? So that's what I'm actually interested in, what he has to say about it, not whether he's heard of it or, anyway, I just find that a really weird response.
Just have done reading into this in my own time, and so I have.
Sorry for being a black shadow. Oh, look, you can see me better.
Okay. Avoid questions about the specifics of causation when he's asked about them. I know.
Oh, he's probably getting that from the debate he had with Sean Carroll. Okay. Well, Carroll brought up objections to Craig's causal principle, accusing it of being needlessly medieval or Aristotelian, and causation has advanced so far in the last few thousand years. So I'm not sure exactly what photo got that. If I had to bet again, I bet photo got that from the Carroll-Craig debate. But there are articles all over the Reasonable Faith website and all over his published work that goes into his views on theories of causation and stuff like that. Just type it in Google. It comes up with Reasonable Faith Q&A stuff.
Okay, before he said.
So I've read a large fraction of the work that Craig has published on apologetics, not so much of the theology stuff. I will say I'm a bit rustier on, or less familiar with what he's written in the last couple of years, because my book came out about 3 years ago now. However, I doubt that he said a lot new, except for maybe some historical atom stuff that he's been working on in the last 3 years on this stuff. And so where I get this from is that I've not found that Craig has engaged much at all with the metaphysics of causation. I do recall there was an article, I don't remember where, it may be on his website, where he did talk a bit about counterfactual theories of causation, just to mention that briefly. That's actually a little bit different to what we're talking about here. The metaphysics of causation is sort of slightly at a higher level than theories of causation. Well, high level is maybe the wrong word. It's a bit more abstract, let's say, than theories of causation. But anyway, the point is, I'm not aware of Craig having addressed this particular issue about causation as a relation between spatiotemporal events before, nor have I heard him say much about theories of causation or what effect that might have on the Kalam. I remember he has said that he doesn't think it matters what theory of causation you hold. However, I actually think that Kalam can only really make sense under a counterfactual theory of causation, or possibly some other views, like there's views of causation, the pluralistic theories of causation. I suppose it could go through on that. Anyway, so I actually think this is quite important, and Craig has written relatively little about this. I'm not aware of any scholarly writing that he's done on this. I'm happy to be corrected. So anyway, that's where I get that. That's where I get that from.
He's like,
hey, chat, you guys know what Fodor is? I thought he was a philosopher. I could have sworn he's a philosopher. I could be wrong. Is he just an independent thinker, autodidact type guy? I don't know.
it doesn't depend on the details of causation.
Not really either. I guess I'm a scientist, a neuroscientist, if you want to put it that way, but I'm not sure that is germane. But I think someone says I'm an engineer. I don't know where they get that from. I've never been an engineer.
But what I did want to do is just talk about some reasons why we might at least have some reason for thinking that this notion of causality is true. So let me see if I can successfully share my screen and not kill the sound like I did last time. Okay, let's start with this one.
Blake, from Real Theology. What's with the revenge of the engineers? They're coming after us. My grandfather was an engineer.
Hopefully that's big enough. I don't know why it comes across so small. Okay, so this is the Stanford Encyclopedia, a philosophy article about the metaphysics of causation.
Okay.
It's kind of dry, but there are some useful parts to this for our purposes here. So this
is not dry, Fodor. How dare you?
This is talking about what things must be true for causation to be a thing. Like what is it like for causation to work? What are the things? In particular, a question here is the relator or relator. So what this means is causation is supposed to be a relation, right? A relation between cause and effect. So what are those things that are related?
Correct.
What is the nature of cause and effects such that they form that relationship with each other? And
I'm sure Craig has no idea what this is about. The relata. There's a relationship between cause and effect. Craig would be like, "What is going on here? I had no idea." Just kidding. Love you guys.
As it says here, the standard view of the causal relata is that they are the category of event and that their number is 2 in the roles of cause and effect. So what that's saying there is that the standard view of causation is that there are two things that relate to each other, the cause and the effect, and that they are events.
Okay. You see that bold word right there? Hold on. See that bold word right there? Options. These are options. So this is one option, Fodor. This is what makes you think this is the standard view. Okay, the standard view has, of course, look. Okay, standard view. Got it, my bad.
He did say my bad now. I thought that was I'm literally reading from. It's like, why I think this is a standard view. This is one of the reasons I reference this, because it's, I think, a reasonably authoritative source. But anyway, let's keep going.
Has been disputed on all counts. Look at this next sentence. The standard view is, can you guys see that? The standard view
Maybe
is,
if he didn't interrupt me mid-sentence, he would have seen that I was just about to say that.
Here, we'll come back to that. So I found this.
Can you let me finish my sentence? Like, I was literally mid-sentence reading that quote. I find that I haven't watched the rest of the part of it.
Causal principle. So this is a Q&A, right?
I find that really annoying. I don't mind him interrupting to talk about, like, comment on what I said, but then to interrupt mid-sentence and go to something else before I could even finish the point, I find that that just rubs me the wrong way. Because the whole point that I was making, which hopefully he will get to, is obviously it's been challenged on all accounts, but if it's the standard view, at the very least, Craig can have something to say about it. Remember, Craig said he can't even think of a reason why someone would think that causation is a relationship between spatiotemporal events. So what Craig is then saying is that he can't even think of a reason why anyone would think, or why he would think, that the standard view of causation is the correct one, which is a pretty strange thing to say, right? Now, it's perfectly fine to disagree with the standard view, but to say that you can't even think of any reason why you would think that the standard, like, that's just really odd, I think. And again, gives an argument as to why it's in Craig's interest, or why I think it's helpful for the discourse for Craig to actually say something about why he rejects the standard view, or why it seems like he would have to reject the standard view for his argument to go forward. That is precisely the point I was making. Hopefully we'll get back to that.
See that? Can you guys see that? Yeah, there we go. Question 265. Let's see. So this view comes up. Look, let's do it. Let me bring this over here so I can see it. Can I make this bigger? Let's drag this sucker over. 2012, almost 10 years ago. Let's see. All right. Contemporary theories of causation do not think things stand in causal relations. It looks like Craig is aware of this, but events are states of affairs. Oh my goodness. Craig is aware of what Fodor's talking about? This is insane. This cannot be. So he admits this is a standard view. Contemporary theories of causation do not think of things as standing in causal relations. And then he brings up the brick example, okay? Then he has this problem. Okay, one way to respond to this problem would be to challenge the adequacy of contemporary analyses, right? The standard view, which exclude things from counting as causes, things from counting as causes. One needn't deny, see, this is what I was saying. You don't need to deny that events or states of affairs can be causally related, but so can things. I think this is a reasonable response. I note that in Alfred Ferdowsi's brilliant translation of Suarez's work here, he argues that Suarez's account of causation in terms of causal agents and patients is superior to any of the contemporary accounts of causal relation. Okay, so there's the issue of causal relata. Craig seems to be aware of this 9 years ago. But we needn't needlessly butt heads either. One can simply reformulate the argument to take into account modern sensibilities. So he reformulates Kalam in terms of theories of causation that are relationships between events, but not necessarily spatiotemporal events. Okay, so if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its beginning. Okay, a cause of its beginning, that's an event. Okay, what stands in need of a cause is an event, namely the universe is beginning to exist, and the cause will be God's creating the universe, another event. Now this right here could be construed in terms of temporal spatiality, because further on in the SCP article on the metaphysics of causation, they're going to go over simultaneous causation. Now, simultaneous causation can occur in the context of timelessness or time, the first time, depending on your theory of time. So at that first moment, okay, where God brings the universe into being at t = 0, okay, and that cause and that effect are simultaneous events, but they're two different events, but they happen simultaneously. That does not mean that this event, God's creating the universe, didn't happen explanatorily prior to the universe is beginning to exist. And so this is not contradict premise 1 of Kalam at all. Because the argument is so easily reformulated in terms of events, I suspect that this is why no one to my knowledge has ever objected to the argument on the grounds that you mentioned. Is that they have to make it spatiotemporal, but you have to endorse a causal theory of time. You have to say that let me bring myself back up. That there's temporal passage between cause and effect, not simultaneity. So either simultaneity in terms of timelessness, simultaneity in terms of there being time, but the cause and effect are happening at the same time. Okay. Either way, this isn't an undercutting defeater to premise 1 at all, because you can have that in terms of, well, I guess not spatio-temporal events. You know, God would still be spaceless, even though he's temporal, because he's spirit. Don't listen to Irenic on that. He's way off on that. Love you, Irenic. Okay, let's go back.
Okay, so let me just comment on that. So I do recall reading that article at some point in my preparation for the book. One of the reasons I didn't discuss it is kind of for the reason that Craig says, right? Because it's fairly easy to get around that by reformulating the first premise. Note that the main point that's discussed in that article that MJ just mentioned is about whether you think of causation as kind of a relation involving states of affairs or objects versus events. And Craig often talks about the universe as an object coming into being or state of affairs coming into being as opposed to an event. But you can easily reformulate the Kalam in terms of events. Now, the issue there is the difference between, or the key point here is the difference between just events and spatiotemporal events. And there's a very specific reason why I talk about spatiotemporal events, right? Because that's a more specific, much more specific view, as MJ himself noted, right? So Craig has, that article is probably the most Craig ever says about this. And that's why I say that Craig has spent, to my knowledge, not written anything in the academic literature. Note that he didn't cite himself in that. He just mentioned a few other philosophers talking about this. And so that's why I say Craig has not addressed this very much at all. The idea that causes a relation between spatiotemporal events, I think, is difficult to reconcile with the Kalam, as distinct from just the idea that causation is a relation between events, because it's hard to see how God can be the cause if causes have to be spatiotemporal events, right? There's a sort of I think a disconnect there between understanding how the very first spatiotemporal event can be caused by something that is itself not a spatiotemporal event. It doesn't really work, right? So that's where the issue lies. So I don't see how that article in any way undermines what I was saying, essentially because it doesn't relate to spatiotemporal events in any way. I think the problem there was inserting that before I kind of got to that point. He just cut me off halfway through the first sentence. So maybe we'll sort of come back to that. Before we did that, though, one thing I would note is how come Craig didn't say anything about this when I asked that question of him? It would have been a good opportunity for him to rehash some of this material from that post 10 years, nearly 10 years ago, that he rarely talks about. Even if he just said the same thing, at least that would have been better than what he did, right? Which was just to dodge the question entirely. So again, why did Craig not say some of that? That would have been at least more of a discussion to have than just ignoring what I said.
I don't know, but does that make sense to everybody? Am I making sense or am I random? Rob is an engineer. He's Rob. Let's see, Rob Rowe. Oh, gotcha. All right, let's bring up the video again. I'm just bringing that up because he's making it sound like Craig has no idea what's going on when it comes to these theories of causation.
Yeah, so that's MJ's interpretation. I don't recall saying anything of the sort that Craig doesn't know about theories of causation. I don't think much of Craig's intellectual honesty. I've not been shy about that. I think he's quite aware of these things and doesn't talk about them because it's difficult and he knows that it's contentious and a lot of people find it confusing and he doesn't find it useful to go there most of the time. So he prefers to dodge and just sort of hope that it's not raised. I'm not saying he couldn't have a response or there's not more things he could say or that he's not aware of it. I mean, regardless of that, or if I'm wrong about Craig's motivations is irrelevant. I don't even see how that's important for the point of for what we're discussing here. Again, I feel like that's the defensiveness coming across. MJ perhaps feel like I've been mean to Craig, and so he feels the need to defend him. Whereas what I say really has nothing to do with Craig as a person. It's just about his argument.
And I'm not sure that is the case.
I've gone quiet.
Now, did you hear what I just read? Right. I think he does at the end of the day, like think, he goes after Ferdoso. He thinks it's in terms of causal agents and patients, right? But he has no like complaint against construing a level of description.
Skip that over.
So he doesn't have avenophobia.
Yeah.
The Kalam can be reformed.
Why am I muted?
There's two ways to understand that. You can not think of a reason in the sense that, wow, there are no reasons floating around in my head for why this could be true. Or he can't think of a reason because all the reasons he has considered.
Oh, I think he made the mistake that I did. I think he forgot to reshare the audio, which is why you can't hear me. That was the mistake that I made on one of my earlier streams. Rookie mistake. Yeah, let's hope he picks that up soon.
Has turned out to be bad reasons. And so in that sense, he doesn't have a reason to accept it. So I'm not sure which one. We'd have to ask Craig. I have no idea.
Yeah, but Craig could have clarified, right?
Why didn't Craig propounding a complete theory of causation? You're propounding a complete theory of causation here. Provide an argument for it. They want Craig to do all the work here. No, you guys provide an argument. Fodor says later on he's going to provide a reason, which is cool. Let's hear it.
Again, Craig does need to do some work if he wants people who hold different views about causation to be persuaded by his argument. I've rehashed that point ad nauseum. And when he's given an opportunity, I mean, I feel like AMG is making inconsistent arguments here. On the one hand, he says Craig's fully aware of this, he's written about it. But on the other hand, he also says, but he doesn't actually have to say anything about it. I guess those aren't technically they don't contradict, but they're in a bit of tension, right? I mean, anyway. I hope he realizes that I'm muted soon because it's a bit hard to keep track of what I've said.
Oh, wow, really? Okay, well, Craig has no problem with it. And look, right there.
He hasn't noticed yet.
The standard view has, of course, been disputed on all accounts. Look at all these people.
You interrupted me when I read
Armstrong,
that.
Blah, 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 blah. Okay, I mean, this isn't a slam dunk case. No sound of Fodor. Oh, my goodness.
There we go. Let's fix that.
Sorry about that. I'm so annoyed.
A reason to think that causation could be a relationship between spatiotemporal events. So what I'm saying is I think there are actually reasons to think that, not definitive, but at least there are reasons. So first of all, as the Stanford Encyclopedia is saying, the standard view of causation is that it's a relationship between events. So already we've got
How does it not matter if that's the standard view, right? If a lot of philosophers think this way about causation, and as MJ says, that is in conflict with the Kalam, how does that not matter for Craig making the argument then? I don't... Yeah, I'm not sure what else to say. And how does that not matter? At the very least, you would want to say, okay, look, a lot of people are going to take issue with this, or they're going to find this as an objection. If it's brought to their attention, then let's see what I want to say in response to that to move the discussion forward. So surely it matters, right? From purely the point of view of, does the fact that other people hold a different view, defeat my argument? Well, no, it doesn't, right? But if you care about the discourse, then I think it matters.
Out of the way there, let's now look more about the type of event. Now, as it says here, the standard view has been disputed. So again, I'm not saying this is definitive. There are many other views that people have of causation, but at least this is a standard view that the two things related are the events.
Okay, this is second order evidence. I don't like the second order evidence stuff. T-Jump pulls this stuff, and I don't like it. Look, it's the standard view. Why? Because a lot of people are convinced by the arguments for it. Okay, let's talk about the arguments. That's all I care about. Let's talk about the arguments and what the critics of the arguments have to say against their arguments and what the proponents of the standard view say against their reasons against their arguments for the standard view. And let's go back and forth. Let's talk about the arguments. The second order evidence about it being the standard view is like, I don't know, it's rhetorically sounds cool, but it doesn't do anything for me personally.
Now that is very interesting. We could have a long discussion about that possibly, because I completely disagree on that front. I take peer disagreement very seriously. I don't actually think that view works because we have to rely on authority for most of our beliefs about technical issues. And we can't just accept like, what does the evidence say? We generally have to say, well, look, what's the standard view, or at least what are the main views, and think that and align our positions with those, or at least I think that is the best available option that we have. And unless you just want to withhold judgment about everything that you personally haven't spent a lot of time researching yourself, but that's not feasible either, right? Because then you'd like never get in a car and never fly in an airplane and never take medicine and never really do much of anything, right? Because you couldn't personally validate these sort of technologies. unless you want to rely on anecdotal evidence, but that has its own problems. Anyway, there's a long discussion to be had there. I'm quite persuaded by ideas that take pure disagreement very seriously. So that is to say, if a lot of thoughtful people hold a view, like say in philosophy, that itself is reason to take it seriously, even if you personally don't find it very persuasive and don't agree with their assessment of the evidence. It's one of the reasons I engage with theism so seriously, even though I personally don't find the arguments persuasive. I think I need to take seriously the fact that other thoughtful people do. Now, there are sociological and other factors going on, of course, that need to be considered. So there's a long discussion to be had there. I'm not trying to present this as a slam dunk, but I just think it's interesting that we have different views about this. I think that what MJ calls second order evidence is extremely important. And the mere fact that I personally don't find an argument convincing, given my limitations and lack of knowledge, I mean, it matters, obviously, right? Because I'm the one engaging with the arguments. But also, I need to consider the second order evidence as well and take that seriously. So I think that's interesting. But yeah, obviously, that goes beyond this discussion here.
Now, another question one can ask is, what sort of thing are the events specifically? And again, there's detail here that I don't really want to get into, but what I wanted to emphasize, here it is. So in practice, the two main differentiating characteristics of there are two main differentiating characteristics that one finds invoked. The first is immanence. What this is saying is that events are generally regarded as immanent, while facts are regarded as transcendent. I think the way it's using the word fact here is meaning a true proposition, as far as I can tell. But
well, let's go up and read it. What is the category of the causal relata? What sort of thing are they? An account of the category of the relata should first determine which characteristics differentiate events from facts from the others, and then identify which characteristics the relata must have. You guys understand that? An account of the category of the relata should first determine which characteristics differentiate events from facts from the others. So in practice, there are two main differentiating characteristics that one finds invoked. The first is eminence. Events and the others are generally regarded as eminent, while facts are generally regarded as transcendent. That is, the event of Brutus's stabbing Caesar is something concrete that occurs at a particular spatiotemporal location. Okay, when we're talking about spatiotemporal objects, of course, descended on the Ides of March. While the fact that Brutus stabbed Caesar is something abstract. The fact that Brutus stabbed Caesar is something abstract and non-spatiotemporal. The question then arises as to whether causation requires eminent or transcendent relata. Hey, family, do you want to get the bottles for you? Are you sure? I'll bring them up. They can wait. My family is more important than my audience.
Location, right? So an event is a concrete thing. It happens at a particular time, particular place. They particularly use the word spatiotemporal location.
So that was very confusing. I'm trying to go through this particular passage to make a point. And I was just saying, as far as I can tell, by fact, they mean a true proposition. And I say that because they talk about it as being abstract. If you think of a fact as a state of affairs, then that's not really abstract, or at least I wouldn't think of it that way. I prefer the notion of a fact as a state of affairs, right? But that would be then concrete, right? Rather than abstract, which is like the fact that as a true proposition. Anyway, that's why I mentioned that. But MJ just sort of read a bunch of it and then got distracted and then went back to the video. I don't know. I just found that confusing, but it's not a big deal.
Location.
Yeah, that's only if you're talking about spatiotemporal objects. Then the event's going to be spatiotemporal.
I wish you would just listen to me try to make my point, right? I understand that he has a different view, but he keeps interrupting so often that he loses the flow of what I'm trying to say.
Causation in terms of certain objects that are implied by arguments from natural theology.
That compares to the fact that Brutus stabbed Caesar, which is abstract. Again, I assume that they're stating that as if it's a proposition, like propositions are abstract, whereas the things that they describe,
facts and propositions, are not the same thing at all.
Are like specific and concrete.
Well, no. See, that's what I was saying before. There are people who think that facts are true propositions, and so facts are the same thing as I guess they're a subset of propositions. I think that a better view, in my view, of facts is that they are states of affairs. For a lot of purposes, it doesn't make that much of a difference, right? In some cases, I think here it does matter. You just need to be clear on your usage. But yeah, I disagree with him that. I just disagree with what he said there. It depends on your view of facts, right?
Great. So that's what they mean by.
But they are both abstract.
Immanent rather than transcendent.
Well, no,
but the point I'm getting at here is simply to say that, again,
states of affairs aren't abstract. States of affairs are concrete. That's what it's saying here. The event of Brutus stabbing Caesar is something concrete that occurs at a particular spatiotemporal location. So that's like a thing that happens that you could watch, like a set of molecules moving in a certain way because it's spatiotemporal, right? The fact that Brutus stabbed Caesar is something abstract and non-spatiotemporal. That sounds to me like they're saying it is a proposition that has a truth value. It's abstract. You can't see the fact that something. You can see the thing happening. You can't see the fact that. You can't point to the fact that, right? Because it's a proposition. A proposition is abstract. So that's how I'm understanding what this is saying here. Again, I would actually use the fact to refer to the concrete state of affairs itself. And so I wouldn't make the distinction this way. But that's fine. Like, that's just different use of words. I'm not too bothered by that. That's just why I raised the point there. So I don't, they're not both abstract, right? That's the whole point of this piece, of this paragraph here, it's distinguishing between abstractly referring to something, or a proposition that is an abstraction that refers to something, and the thing being referred to, which is the concrete event or, state of affairs that actually took place. That there's a difference between those two things there. And what this is trying to get at is that which of those you regard as the relator of causation is going to have an effect on your views about causation. Does causation relate the abstract things, or does it relate the concrete things? I think it relates concrete things.
This is a fairly standard view here, that the things that are related by the causal relationship are imminent specific events that occur at a particular spatiotemporal location. So already that is a decent way along to saying that events are things that are, causation
This all applies only if we're talking about spatiotemporal objects. This entire section of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, this article on the metaphysics of causation, is just assuming we're talking about spatiotemporal objects. And so, of course, the causal relator are going to be relations between spatiotemporal events. So this is completely irrelevant to me.
So this is disappointing. He seemed to want to get into the details of this argument, but now he's just saying, look, I don't care. I, MJ, don't care, because it's irrelevant to him because it's all talking about spatiotemporal events. I don't know that that's true. I haven't read the entirety of the article, right? But obviously a lot of it is talking about that. But you see, this is the issue. If I, as a naturalist, like many philosophers who are naturalists, or at least non-supernaturalist, and naturalism has its own definitional problems, if we're engaging in an analysis of causation and we come to a view that seems to exclude the kind of argument that Craig wants to give, then we're going to say, look, the way I've analyzed causation, I don't think that your view really works. Maybe you're going to have to use a different concept than causation to convince me that this actually works. And MJ's kind of response is, I don't care because I don't think of it that way. Well, look, I wasn't trying to convince you, MJ. I wasn't trying to convince Craig. I'm trying to illustrate to people that there's a plausible view here that people take seriously who analyze the philosophy of causation, the metaphysics of causation, and that this view, I think, plausibly would pose significant issues, would essentially contradict a part of Craig's Kalam. That's the point I'm trying to make. Whether MJ personally or Craig or anyone else specifically is convinced by that is a secondary issue to the point that I'm trying to make. Yeah, of course, you might have other reasons for thinking that this analysis of causation is false, such as that you're a theist, right? It's not trying to convince people who have different reasons. It's just presenting this particular analysis as, look, for people who accept this analysis, and obviously there are people who do, because there is, I'm gesturing at some reasons here, but the point is not to establish definitively. It's just to say, look, at least there are some reasons why you might think this. And remember, Craig said he couldn't think of any. So I'm illustrating some things that Craig, being familiar with this article, as MJ pointed out, he almost certainly is, should at least be aware enough of to say, look, yeah, okay, some people do think this about causation. Here's why I think they're wrong. Why couldn't Craig have just said that? And then we wouldn't need to have had this video. I would have actually known what Craig said, and I could respond to his arguments.
Relationship that exists between spatiotemporal events. So this article hasn't, of course, proven that that's the case, but I've just shown a couple of extracts to indicate that this combination is not at all an unusual or absurd view. It's pretty standard to think that causation relates.
Craig wouldn't think it's an absurd view, as we just read.
Whoa, but Craig said he can't think of any reason why you would hold the view. I suppose that's not the same as saying that it's absurd. But I mean, if you can't think of any reasons why you would hold the view, and that sounds, I don't know, that sounds a long way to being absurd to me. Yeah, I guess, yeah, we'd have to ask MJ what he thinks the relationship between those two things is. But yeah, I guess the way I would say it, if I can't think of any reason why you would hold a view, then that's my way of saying, yeah, that's a pretty crazy, nutty, absurd view. So yeah, to me, they're pretty similar.
Spatiotemporal events. Now, I have a little bit more that I want to share.
Are you sure you want my help? I love you. There's thousands of people watching right now.
This is really distracting. Can't you at least mute when you're talking to other people?
And I want to share a different article, Causation in Physics. So this is also Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article.
Physics.
So I'll show you this.
Of course. Of course, in physics, it's going to be a relationship between spatiotemporal events.
So this article.
Oh dear, well that's a problem, right? Because Craig appeals to findings from physics to establish or to further. I know he thinks that the philosophical arguments themselves are sufficient, but he at least thinks the physics arguments add extra weight or provide extra support for his for Craig's arguments. I think both of them actually, the causal one and the universe beginning to exist. But either way, if we have a reason to accept a certain view of causation that is partly based on findings from physics or philosophy of physics, that can serve to undermine conclusions that we may have, or some people may have argued for on other bases, right? So I don't really see it's like MJ is willing to say, look, I as a theist, I don't actually know that MJ is a theist, but I'm gathering that he is from what he said so far. But I mean, if I'm wrong there. But the point is, if MJ is happy to say as a theist, he has additional reasons for thinking that causation is a certain way, or, whatever view, right? then why can't the naturalist say, look, I, as a naturalist, or at least as a non-supernaturalist, have reasons for thinking that causation is a certain way. And those might come from philosophy of physics, or they might come from somewhere else, right? That's the point I'm trying to establish. There are people who hold these views, and there are, seriously discussed, they're not fringe crazy views, right, about causation, which would mean that they won't accept the Kalam. They'll have reasons for rejecting one of the key premises. What does Craig have to say to these people? That is my question. Is there something wrong with that question? Is there a reason we can't have this dialogue instead of just saying, oh, look, I don't care about that. It's physics. Pff, who cares? Or, oh, I don't accept that theory of causation. But yet you might not, Craig might not, but what about people who do? What does he have to say to these people? How can we pursue the conversation?
Here talks about causation in physics, obviously, and it's sort of looking at causation from a more science-based physics or maybe reductionistic standpoint, which unsurprisingly is kind of how I think about it as well, being a reductionist.
So do I when I'm in the context of physics. What does this have to do
Interesting.
with theories of causation as it relates to things that are outside the purview of physics?
Well, but as a reductive naturalist, I don't think anything is outside the purview of physics in the way that I think he means it. And again, that's a point of contention, right? That'd be a good thing to talk about. But again, MJ just seems to be so defensive. It's like, well, but my view says there are things outside the purview of physics, so I can think that, and you haven't shown that there can't be things outside the purview of physics. But MJ, I wasn't trying to say that. I'm trying to explain how, under my view, there's nothing outside the purview of physics. And so if I learn about causation through physics, I think that tells me about kind of all there is to know about causation. I mean, maybe that's a bit strong because you have to do your philosophical analysis as well, but you get the point I'm making, that I can learn about causation through physics. And then I'm going to come to metaphysical views that are then going to be a blocker for me to accept Craig's premises or some of Craig's premises. That's the point I'm trying to make. And also that, and a lot of other people have this view as well, because they're pretty common views in philosophy. So I think Craig should be responding to this, should be interested in responding to these, and should at least have some idea of why people would hold these views, unlike what he said, which is he has no idea why someone would hold these views.
Naturalist. But so there's a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to go through anything like all of this, but I just wanted to sort of draw your attention to what they call here conserved quantity accounts of causation.
Nice.
But these are also called causation, which essentially says that there's some sort of physical process that occurs whenever there's a...
I'm pretty sure Craig's going to believe that if there's a physical process, that the proper theory of causation about what's going on there, especially if there's no agents or patients, is that there's a relationship going on between two spatiotemporal events. Of course, this is completely irrelevant to me. Am I way off, everybody? Oh, wait. Amir, what's going on? What's up? Footer wants the burden of proof completely on the person affirming the Kalam. Question mark. I don't know about in all aspects, but in that particular aspect, it looks like he wants Craig to do all the work in providing arguments against this possible theory of causation that would undermine certain construals of premise one in the Kalam cosmological argument. When, I think a proper way to do this is, it's the onus is on the person that's presenting the possibility. The theory as a possibility. Provide an argument for that theory and show why it's true so that we can challenge it. And all Fodor's saying is, look, I mean, you're dismissing it just because it's possible and you see no reason for why it's true, or you can't think of a reason for why it's true. First of all, it's just completely incompatible with the way the conclusion is functioning, the way the cause is functioning in the conclusion of the Kalam. It's incompatible with it. It can't be metaphysically necessary in every single circumstance. But anyway, if this is the case, and if he rejects the Kalam, he has to justify his rejection of the Kalam. This is burden shifting. No, I don't see why that's the case at all. If this is the case, and he rejects the Kalam, I'm not saying he would reject the entire Kalam. I thought we were just talking about that first premise. But okay, yeah, connect the first premise with the whole argument. Okay, if he would have to justify his rejection of the Kalam. I think it'd be sufficient for his rejection of the Kalam to propose that theory of causation, which would be incompatible with the first premise, and then provide an argument for why that theory is true to the person that actually accepts the Kalam. But I don't think that's burden shifting. Craig's already supported the argument. He's already provided 3 arguments for why the premise 1 is true. And you got this other guy coming along. He's like, well, what about this other theory of causation, which seems incompatible with the premise 1? And then Craig goes, well, okay, give me an argument for why that's true. I don't think that's an illicit question. Am I wrong there?
Oh, it's not an illicit question at all for Craig to ask for an argument of say, this particular view. That's a perfectly fine question. What it's illicit, I think, for Craig to do, or at least I don't think he should do it. Let's maybe back off slightly from illicit. I don't think Craig should just say, I don't see any reason for accepting that view. I asked Craig, if this view about causation is true, what implications does it have for the Kalam? That was the question. I think that's a perfectly fine question. For Craig just to say, why accept that view, is dodging the question. Now, it's also perfectly fine for Craig to ask me why accept that view, and then I can answer that question, right? And I have made a number of videos on this, and I do want to be doing more work on this. It's a tricky area. So that's why I want to back away slightly from what I said before about burdens of proof, because I actually don't know if I use that phrase before, but burdens of proof is such a tricky thing. And Oppie has said before that there really isn't such a thing in philosophy. Although other philosophers would say differently, I guess, because I've definitely read that. But what I would say is if you're making an argument and you expect your sort of epistemic peers to be persuaded by this argument or accept the premise of this argument, then I think that there is let's say a discursive norm that you provide reasons that will at least have, that will at least be able to have some attraction or pull or persuasive force on those that you're talking to. And so if say that a bunch of people that you're talking to hold a particular view of causation that will render them unlikely or mean that they're not going to accept one of your premises, I think that that's strong reason discursively and epistemically for you then to provide a reason or to say something about that view, right? To say why it's wrong or say why it doesn't matter for the argument or whatever. Now, in a sense, Craig doesn't have to do that. And the merely raising the possibility doesn't refute Craig's argument. But I think it's a reason. I think it's also fine for the person who rejects Craig's argument to simply say, I hold a different view of causation without having to give a defense of that view. This is just like the Christian who says, well, look, I don't accept that the Quran is a holy book. So, I don't, and not feel that they have to defend why they don't accept the Quran as a holy book. I think everyone should be open to and engage seriously with views that are seriously held and have been defended by people that they're discussing with, right? So across the board, we should be engaging with and giving reasons. But in terms of do you have to? Well, you don't have to, but it's a question of what do you want to engage in with the discourse and what do you want to achieve? So yeah, I would like to move away from the notion of burden of proof and just talk about the idea that, look, why doesn't Craig talk more about this? Why couldn't he answer my question simply?
I'll think of an example probably in a second.
A causal, whenever a cause brings about an effect. So this is sometimes talked about.
By the way, I'm trying to answer Craig's question, right? At least in brief, right? Why might someone think that causation is a relation between spatio-temporal events? The first point that I alluded to in the first article on Stanford was that causation is widely thought to be something that's imminent, right? So it's something that relates specific events that occur at specific places and times. Remember the example of Brutus stabbing Caesar? That's a spatio-temporal event. It happens at a specific place and a specific time. That's how we typically talk about causation as, particular person or particular thing acting in a particular time and place. So I think that that's prima facie reason, at least sort of as a starting point to think about, well, it kind of looks like that this is a spatio-temporal concept. So that was the first argument that I made as to, an indicative reason. Obviously, this is not going to be definitive, right? Because I'm just gesturing at some basic ideas. But that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to say, well, look, let's think about some reasons why we might think this as a starting point for the discussion. So I'm actually trying to take up that burden to an extent, right? Obviously, I can't fully discourse on this philosophical point there. But whereas Craig just ignored the question and said, why think that? I'm trying to advance the discussion by saying, well, here are some reasons why we might think that. And then hopefully we can take the discussion forward there.
Transmission of a mark, because the original description was in terms of imagine you put a chalk put a piece of chalk marking on a billiard ball, and then you what's the word? What do you do in pool? You push that ball over to, and it hits another ball on the table, and then it transmits some of that chalking onto another ball. Mm-hmm. That's a sort of analogy to what's being understood in terms of there's a physical transmission of some physical thing. And one of the ways to understand that is it's a conserved quantity, like energy or momentum or something like that. That the transmission of conserved quantities as in the process of physical interactions is what happens when you have.
So God is not a material object, so God would be an instance of a certain configuration of energy. And so this is completely irrelevant to what's going on at t equals 0. Here. Yeah, sorry.
This is really frustrating, right? MJ's response to what I'm saying here about why people might think that this notion of causation spatio-temporal is theists won't agree with this, at least at the start of the universe. Well, obviously theists won't agree with that because God created the universe, right? So causation can't entirely be transmission of conserved quantities if God created ex nihilo. I'm fully aware, obviously, right? We all know that if we think about it for a second. But the point is, hey, I think that this is kind of a plausible view of causation. Other people think it's a plausible view. What are we supposed to do? Just accept your word for it that God is the exception? Well, why can't we actually talk about it and engage with the pros and cons of our different views? Again, MJ's response seems so defensive to me. All he says is that he doesn't agree with the view. And kind of the conversation stops there, even though I'm offering reasons. I mean, it's just intro to the conversation, right? It's not definitive, but I'm starting, right? Because this is what I was saying before. It seems like anything that I say, it wouldn't matter how many arguments that I gave, MJ, for all of them, would find something to say, oh, I'm not going to agree with that. I'm a theist, or, I don't agree with that. God doesn't, it's not spatio-temporal. So when someone's responding that way, it's sort of like, what's the point of having the discussion? Because they're not actually willing to consider anything that you say or try to weigh up your view for its own merits and then compare it to their view. They're just going to reject anything that is different to their view. And if you actually have that view and you sort of engage that way, you can kind of never learn anything, right? Because anything that's different to what you already think, you just say, well, I don't agree with that. That's wrong. I have a different view, right? How can you ever be persuaded that you're wrong, or even that you need to change your mind if you do this every time? I think it's just a terrible way of engaging. We can also do this sometimes, right? Dig in our heels, but the point is that you try to consider someone's view, understand it as well as you can, and then weigh it up against yours and give your reasons for thinking why you think yours is superior. Simply rejecting each particular point that the other person says as in conflict with your view is a useless way of engaging in dialogue.
I might be misunderstanding. What I mean is, he's rejecting the premises. He has to justify his rejection. It's second order burden of proof. Simply rejecting it without justification for rejecting it is irrational. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, and mere possibilities just don't do anything for me. I mean, I guess in terms of...
Yeah, so the point here is not that I just said, I disagree with the premise one. I said, I disagree with premise one because, for one reason, I think that causation is a relation between spatial temporal events, and therefore it's impossible that the universe could have had a cause, right? So the premise is anything that begins to exist had a cause. Now, if causation is a relation between spatial temporal events, and MJ seems to agree with this, then it's not possible that the universe had a cause. So the conclusion of the Kalam must be false under this view. That's why I reject it. It's not the only reason, right? But this is the relevant one here. So a reason has been given. Now, you might say, well, do I need to defend my view that causation is a relation between spatial temporal events? Well, if I'm asked to defend it, then I should defend it, right? Discursively and sort of epistemically. But at the same time, if Craig then says that view is not true, then he needs to defend that view. Anyone who makes a claim needs to defend the claim is the point I'm making, whether you're arguing for or against the argument. But I don't think that it's sufficient for Craig to just say, well, I think that the view is true. I mean, surely, again, do you want people to be persuaded by it? If so, then surely you want to say something more to it than that.
Of subjective rationality, if possibilities do something for you, I want it for
yeah, and this is a controversial position, but so pretty much all the other positions in the metaphysics of causation, like counterfactual theories or regularity theories or intervention theories, and kind of everything is controversial, right? But this is not like some crazy fringe view that no one's ever mentioned before. So,
well, this is a view that would just be automatically disqualified from being a possible defeater for premise one in the context of the Kalam. The Kalam is an argument in the context of natural theology. We're trying to prove the existence of a particular kind of object, a concrete object with a certain set of properties, which, those properties are inferred. They're necessarily inferred because of the kind of cause it is. And because of the kind of properties this cause has, this particular theory of causation just is not going to be compatible with it.
Yes.
But what you don't do is throw out the entire theory. You can keep the theory and apply it where it's appropriate. You just can't say it's metaphysically necessary in all circumstances. It won't be applicable to an immaterial concrete object with causal powers.
Okay, I feel like I must be misunderstanding his point here. Maybe people can help me in the chat, because it really seems like he's saying this theory can't be true because we know the premise, the conclusion of the Kalam is correct. Like it contradicts the Kalam. He seems to be saying it can't be true because it contradicts the Kalam, which was my exact point, right? So what if I hold that the theory is true, or probably true? Like I'm not fully committed, but I think it's probably the best notion of causation, right? Then I'm not going to accept the Kalam. Like that is the whole point that I'm making. And I'm also saying, Craig, what do you have to say to these people? You think this argument is a good one? Well, do you have a response? Like, what do you say to us? Yes, we need to defend our view about causation, but Craig, I think, also has, let's say, an interest, or he should have reasons for wanting to give reasons to defend his view against those who hold this view of causation. So I'm really struggling to understand how MJ thinks that this is like a rebuttal to what I've said. He seems to be agreeing with me and then just saying, well, yeah, but people who think that the Kalam is a good argument, or who agree with the conclusion of the Kalam, agree with the premises of the Kalam, won't accept your theory of causation. To which I say, yeah, that's the point. We have different views of causation, and one view is in conflict with the Kalam. So what if people hold that view? Should we just abandon that view because Craig thinks it's wrong? Like, well, what does Craig have to say about it? That's, I don't know. I feel like there must be more to what he's saying there, but I don't get why MJ thinks that what he said is a response to what I said. I feel like it's just agreeing with what I've said. I want to try to be charitable, though, and admit that I may have missed some subtlety of what he's saying there, but it really does sound like he's agreeing with me, but presenting it as a disagreement.
Please admit this. Craig's moral argument is baloney. No, it's actually awesome.
Oh, dear.
Proceed.
It's actually, I have to disagree with that. Even if there are good versions of the moral argument, which I'm skeptical about, Craig's ain't one of them. He's never published about this, unless he's done it very recently in like a philosophical journal. He's written very little about it. The argument doesn't even try to defend its premises in any sort of rigorous way. And this isn't true for Craig's other arguments. Right? I'm not saying Craig always does this, but I just don't know how you can defend that Craig's moral argument is a philosophically, like, I don't know, well-posed, well-developed argument. I mean, it's a valid argument, but that's, I guess, all you can say about it. There's a reason it's not discussed in philosophical journals, whereas, at least to my knowledge, maybe it is somewhere. Well, I do have one book where Craig does interact with another philosopher about this, but so maybe that's a little strong, but it's not discussed anything like his Kalam is. Anyway, we're getting off topic. That's not relevant to this video.
The point here is just to emphasize that there are people discussing this. And according to this particular view, we can understand causation as kind of the transmission of conserved quantities. Now, I have a slightly different way of thinking about this than it presents.
Yeah, sorry. Let me just clarify. So remember, I've referred to two articles in the point that I was making here. The first one is about metaphysics causation from a more philosophical standpoint. And the key point that was being made is that it seems, in terms of the way we talk about causation, like remember Brutus stabbing Caesar, that the causal relata are imminent, particular, specific things, right? That is events. So that's a reason for thinking that spatiotemporal events might be the relata. Not definitive, but it's, you know, it's something to consider. The other thing that I pointed out is that there's a notion of, there's an idea that's been discussed recently, process theories of causation, that understands causation as transmission of a conserved quantity, which I think fits well with how causation is thought about in physics, although there's a lot of controversy there about second law of thermodynamics and quantum and other stuff, which I'm just not going to talk about now. But the point is, those are two aspects of let's say philosophical discourse that we can grab to and say, look, here are some considerations in favor of this view. It's not supposed to be even an argument. It's just considerations that we're putting on the table as a starting, as a starting point. That's what I was doing with these two references here.
In quite this article, as it presented in this particular article, I think that causation might be something along the lines of a relationship between events at like a quantum level. Like if you think about Feynman diagrams in quantum field theory,
you can't describe God using quantum field descriptions, so it's completely irrelevant. But once you do have quantum phenomena, then you can apply this theory of causation in the terms that Fodor's using right here to that phenomena. Yes, I have read on Craig's moral argument for over 20 years. What have you read on it? SDB, whatever that stands for. You're the man. We can rationally disagree, can't we? This is off the topic real quick. Is this infinite goods? Could be you, Russell, what was his name? Russell Landau. Anybody who drives object is a concrete object. So it's functionally identical to every other moral realist out there.
Moral argument.
So I think it's a lot more sophisticated.
Let's stay focused here.
What a lot of people.
That's a little bit of a point that I want to make is simply that I understand causation as a reducible to physical processes, or at least probably. Like I think that.
I mean, in certain contexts, right? Not in every context.
That's the best.
But MJ, that's just your view, right? I know I'm sharing my view, but the point of sharing my view and gesturing at some reasons is to say, look, Craig, there are those of us who think about causation this way, not even exactly like me, but you know, at least this relationship between spatiotemporal events, who aren't going to be persuaded by your argument because it precludes this understanding of causation, as MJ himself has agreed with. So my challenge to Craig is, what do you have to say to us? Are we just outside the permit? Like, is the Kalam never going to be persuasive to us because you're not addressing this point or this aspect of it? That's what I'm saying here. MJ's response is to say, he, MJ, doesn't agree with me, or others who think of causation this way. Well, okay, yes, fine. How is that a discussion? I agree. I disagree. Let's actually talk about it. Remember, MJ earlier said that he wanted to actually get into the reasons. He didn't want to look at second order arguments. I've offered a couple of reasons, and he hasn't really engaged with those. At least it seems to me. He's just said that he disagrees with them. Saying that you disagree with something is not actually engaging with it, right? It's just saying that you think differently. Sure, right? I understand, MJ, you disagree, and I wasn't attempting to provide a deductive argument for why the view is true. So sure, you can agree, you can disagree, and you're perfectly entitled to do that. But I'm trying to encourage the discourse to move forward here and to be more productive. I think Craig dodged the question initially, which was one of the reasons I made this video, because I felt like he just didn't answer it, and it was a good opportunity for him to move forward. He didn't do that. And I feel like MJ is doing something similar here, where instead of responding to really much of what I've said, apart from, I think the one thing he did say, which was fair, is that I was a bit strong saying that Craig sort of had the burden of proof to say that, because that's quite strong. But apart from that, I feel like he's just said he, MJ, thinks differently. I mean, yeah, yes, different people disagree. Why don't we look at the reasons together and consider, the merits of different positions? That's what I'm really calling for here, and calling for us to stop being defensive and dodging views just by saying, well, why I think that's true. Because whatever your interlocutor says, you can always say, why I think that's true. It's a conversation stopper. It's not actually a good way to do philosophy. Like in most cases, there are times for asking that question, right? But if like that's your one tool, like that's not a good way to do philosophy.
The best account that we have, and there are people who've written about this, as I've just been referring to the causal process theory there.
Okay.
So that's really what I'm
That
getting
sounds
out of that.
interesting. It sounds
Also,
Yeah, let's talk about
entropy and quantum mechanics, causation, radiation,
All that stuff is
quantum mechanics. So lots of good stuff in that article as
I
well.
agree.
But that's what I wanted to show here. So let me just bring back Craig, who I think
Baby, come back.
probably just mostly talk, but in case we want to revisit him. Okay, so what was the point I was making with those articles? The first is that it's pretty standard to think about causation as a relationship between events, and it's also
which Craig doesn't deny, right? He's denying that it's the standard view is it's a spatiotemporal relationship between events, right? Necessarily a spatiotemporal relationship between events.
reasonably standard.
Interestingly, Craig didn't say that, right? MJ is saying that, and I agree with him that Craig needs to deny that. But Craig didn't deny that. I was giving him an opportunity to deny that and make that explicit and you know, put the discussion in that context, but he refused to. He just said, well, I think that is true. And that was one of my main criticisms. And at this point, MJ almost seems like he's forgotten that Craig dodged that and is just saying, yeah, Craig agreed that that's not what causation is. No, he didn't. He dodged the question, which was one of my main initial criticisms. And then he said he can't think of any reason why he would think that this view is true. And I've offered just a couple of reasons, which with MJ and I both agree, Craig should well be aware of these sorts of reasons, at least at some level. So why couldn't he have engaged with them in answering my question or in other places? The closest we came was that blog article, which I think is the best that I can recall having read about this. And he doesn't even really talk about this in very much detail at all. Craig talks about the distinction between like object causation and event causation, which is related, but it's not really the same point. And his remarks were quite brief anyway. And I think this issue is quite important. So yeah, MJ is presenting it as if Craig agrees that causation as spatiotemporal events, as a relation between spatiotemporal events, contradicts the Kalam. But Craig didn't admit that. He didn't say anything to that effect.
Just think about it as a relationship between spatiotemporal events, like specific things that occur in space and time. And there is also a view of causation called the process theories of causation.
And I wonder how many philosophers endorse this theory of causation that are theists.
That are theists?
Or
well, why is that important?
Or whatever. So I wonder if that, if you're a naturalist.
Why aren't they allowed to be well, hang on, he's going to say that.
Or a materialist, and you think all there is this interaction of matter and quantum phenomena and all that stuff, then that theory of causation is going to follow as like a necessary corollary to me. But if your metaphysics includes more than that, or if it's implied by particular arguments in the context of natural theology, then you're probably not going to universalize that theory of causation and make it metaphysically necessary.
In which,
yeah, sure. I would say I don't think that this theory of causation is metaphysically necessary. That's quite a strong claim. I'm open to the idea that there are possible worlds in which causation works differently. But that's another discussion to have. I would also say that I don't know what proportion of philosophers hold to this view. I think it's a minority. I don't think that there is any single view of causation that holds a majority view. I could be wrong about that. I'm just sort of guessing. Hopefully when the new Stanford Encyclopedia, when the new survey of philosophers comes out, we might have some answers to this, because I think they may have asked about this question. But in terms of this being a necessary corollary of naturalism, it certainly isn't, right? Because there are many alternate views, including counterfactual theories of causation, probability theories of causation, regularity views like Hume thought, and interventionist theories of causation, all of which are, I think, by the way, all of which I think are hard to understand. Well, maybe not interventionist, that's a slightly tricky one, but many of those views I think also are hard to square with the Kalam. I think process view is the one that's most explicitly, basically impossible to square with it, because creation ex nihilo is explicitly a rejection of the notion of that there's a conserved quantity, right? But anyway, so the point is that the naturalist has many options on the table that they could think of as the best theory of causation. Really, the only one that they don't have available is some sort of divine theory of causation, or maybe personalist theories of causation. I mean, you could even still think that you could even still believe in agent causation and be a naturalist. You just couldn't think that God wouldn't be such an agent. Anyway, the point is there are lots of theories on the table. Not all of them will preclude Craig's argument, although I think that many of them are problematic for Craig. Process theories, I think, are one of the clearest ones that does, but none of them are necessary corollary of naturalism. They're a further question. It's a result of our analysis of the notion of cause and how it fits into our philosophical and scientific theories.
Which we think of causality as reducible to physical interactions. And so basically the combination of those two theories, which are like...
let me address this real quick. I can't tell if voter is bad faith or just showing great lack of intelligence. It's just really hard. Like I would never go there, because it's really easy for the opposition to always look at you as you're dumb or stupid or ignorant and all that stuff. I'd like to just, until I have further reason to think so, I'd like to just stay at the level of we're just having a rational disagreement, and we're just having a philosophical dialogue about something we rationally disagree about. And then as I flesh that out, it might sound sarcastic sometimes, but I don't think it's necessarily lack of intelligence. I mean, he sounds like an intelligent guy. Sounds like he has common sense. I don't think he's being bad faith. I don't think so. I don't really know him that well. Homeless guy. I just woke up underneath the overpass and got my internet working.
Like not exactly the same, but can be related to each other.
Yeah, I respect that. I appreciate that that answer. I'm not sure what I said that indicates a lack of common sense or bad faith. I feel like that was a bit harsh, because I'm just trying to think what I said that may have indicated that. I mean, it doesn't really matter. I appreciate his response there.
I think you can easily put those together to come to the view that causation is a relationship between spatiotemporal events, and that's all it is. It's not anything else, right?
That deserves argument.
So if we do hold that view, then sorry.
I have so much going on, by the way, John. I did see your call. My bad. Like September.
That leads us to the view that causation is a relationship between spatiotemporal events and not anything else. It's not a relationship between substances and events, and it's not a counterfactual relationship. It's just one spatiotemporal event stands in a relationship to another.
See, it's not a counterfactual relationship. So just because you say that your theory of causation involves two events that are spatiotemporal and they're related to each other spatiotemporally, that does not exclude the other John. But I love you too, Jonathan. I'm sorry. That does not exclude counterfactual theory of causation, because you can just say, okay, yeah, it's a relationship between spatiotemporal events, right? And at the same time, you can say that if event 1 is prior to event 2, explanatorily or causally or temporally, had E1 not happened, then E2 would not have happened. You can say both. So some theories are compatible with each other, so they don't exclude.
Such that
what I was talking about there were process theories of causation, specifically exclude counterfactual ones. But you're right, a lot of them are actually. That's actually been a tenet of the literature, which is that a lot of these views may actually be just answering different questions and maybe consistent with each other. I'm actually quite. I don't like counterfactual views of causation because I think they're. I think they're a bit explanatorily vacuous, because I think we're naturally inclined to ask why the counterfactual holds. And I feel like that a theory of causation should actually have the sort of ontological substance to give an answer to that. And I think that process views do. Obviously, they're making assumptions about like conserved quantities, but those are going to be those are going to underpin that theory. Whereas I think that if you hold a pure counterfactual view, you're left without much resource for saying why certain counterfactuals hold. But yeah, I mean, strictly speaking, you can hold both of them. It's just you might hold one as being more fundamental or something like that.
There's a cause and the effect. What that means is the very first spatiotemporal event, which has no preceding spatiotemporal event, cannot stand in causing previous to cause it, right? Between spatiotemporal events, once you go back to the first one, there's nothing else for it to possibly have caused it.
Right.
So, and I think that Craig's tacitly admitted this with his response that there's no reason to think this account is true, rather than just saying it doesn't matter if it's true, the causal principle will still hold. So I think I've given some at least.
Does Fodor think there's no good reason to think that premise 1 of the Kalam cosmological argument is true?
That's a separate
Because
question.
if he does, then he needs to provide. He needs this. What am I trying to say here? Craig has provided 3 reasons to think that the premise 1 is true, right? He's not convinced by those reasons. So can Fodor say that there is no good reason to think the premise 1 is true, right? And until such time as Craig gives Fodor a reason that sufficiently satisfies him, this is such a pedantic point. I don't know why we're hung up on this.
Whoa. Now, how is this a pedantic point? If this is a defeater for the Kalam if you hold this view. MJ agrees with this. You can't hold this view and accept the Kalam. So how is this a pedantic point? It actually doesn't matter if I have responses to the other. I mean, I've written and spoken about my objections to Craig's other arguments, but I'm not talking about that now. We're just talking about this specific issue. And I think that this alone would be sufficient reason to reject the notion that, or the conclusion really, that the universe began to exist. The universe kind of began to exist if causation doesn't work that way effectively. I'm not saying MJ has to accept that or Craig has to accept that, but that would be a defeater for someone like me or other naturalists who hold a view of this, that sort of view of causation, for accepting the conclusion. How is this pedantic point? I don't understand that.
Maybe I'm too dumb to notice what he's saying. I apologize. Why is Fodor?
Well, I wouldn't claim that.
He's on his key. Oh, you guys are awesome.
Plausible reasons.
Oh, well, that's just how
really sketches of reasons. I haven't made a full argument here, but I've just at least shown that it's not at all completely unreasonable or outside of the ballpark of like what's discussed philosophically.
Did Craig say that? I don't think Craig said that.
Well, he did say he can't think of any reason why he would. Well, I can't remember if it was he would accept that view or someone would accept that view. But either way, that seems to be placing it outside the boundary of reasonable philosophical discourse. At least it seems to me. Otherwise, why would he say that? Why wouldn't he just say, yeah, some people think that, but I disagree? Or here are some reasons, but here's why I don't agree. Why not just say that? Why say what Craig did say? Why push it? I mean, I have cynical answers to that question, right? But that's the point I'm making. I'm trying to illustrate the point that this is a reasonable view to take. It's seriously discussed in the literature. So Craig, I think, has reasons to respond to it and not dodge the question. That is the point.
But he's not saying it's completely unreasonable. He's saying that he needs an argument for why he thinks it's true.
To think that something like this is the case, that causation is a relation between spatiotemporal events. Indeed, there are many philosophers who think that causation is not real at all. It's basically an abstraction or some sort of psychological construct that we put onto the world, or that causation is many different things, and there's no one thing that we're talking about. It's unclear how Craig would rescue his argument on these views as well, but I'm not even going that far.
And we've talked about this in the notes that were given to me in the class that I took under Craig in 2019.
Ooh, are those notes public? I'd be very interested in that.
So I can't address it here, but he's well aware of views
what was that?
Where he addresses this. This isn't a past video, so I can't address it here, but he's well aware of.
I can't address it here. Oh, well, I'm not sure which video he's referring to. That would be interesting. I'm not sure if I've read Craig addressing views that causation is like pluralist views of causation, or that deflationary views of causation, or similar. So that would be interesting.
Of views that deny causation on lower levels of description. We'll get into that. That's like structuralism and all that stuff. Optic structural realism. We talked about that a little bit with Bruce Gordon, where I was getting kicked out because the storm was right outside my window.
Just kind of saying that, well, I think causation is real, but it can be reduced to sort of.
Again, it doesn't matter what Craig's aware of. That's kind of beside the point to the issue here about let's discuss this. The fact that this almost never comes up in debates or in Craig's defense of the Kalam, I think is a problem. I think Craig should discuss this more, because it is absolutely imperative. If you think of causation in particular ways, you're just not going to buy the Kalam. You're not going to think the universe can have a cause, or can have the sort of cause that Craig thinks it did. That's certainly relevant. That's not a pedantic point.
Yes, STB. I know him. He knows me. We hung out a lot when I went to Houston Baptist University. He teaches at Houston Baptist University, and I took 3 classes under the Dr. William Lane Craig. He is a human.
Well, there you go.
He's a human being. He's really cool. He's down to earth. He's awesome. He's a good guy.
Basically physical interactions between spatiotemporal events, like ultimately maybe at a quantum field level or something like that, with the details granted to be worked out. But the point is, I think that there are significant issues here for Craig, because he kind of needs these views of causality to be false in order for his causal principle.
Every single argument that has premises is going to be, exclude. It's going to exclude itself from all the different reasons and theories that are incompatible with it. That's every argument. Is it really on the onus of the proponent of any argument to exclude every possible objection to their view? I mean, maybe you can include standard views. I don't know.
Yes, thank you. That was my point. Not every possible view, but standard views that are widely discussed. At least those should be addressed. Surely that's the mark of a good philosopher. I mean, if you submit a paper to a journal that argues for a certain conclusion, right, and you just don't even consider standard views that would preclude your argument or standard objections, surely they'll say, look, you need to respond to these, right? That's all I'm saying here. Craig needs to say something about this in terms of discursive norms. Like he owes us an account here. And MJ says that he has said these things. Well, I'm not aware of very much. I've talked about a couple of articles that have very brief remarks. I'm not aware of Craig having said things about, say, quantum views of causation. That'd be very interesting. So I can't speak to that because I'm not sure what MJ is referring to here. But also the fact that Craig has an opinion, Craig doesn't have to agree with these views. That's not the point. The fact is that what we're asking for is some engagement with a set of people who disagree with a key sort of premise of Craig here, which is a particular notion, or at least excluding particular notions of causation. By the way, what MJ said is perfectly true, that every argument in philosophy sort of excludes any views that contradict its premises, or views entailed by its premises. That's absolutely right. And that's why I think deductive arguments aren't very good, aren't very useful philosophically, in line with what Oppie said, right? Because if ever at some point your conclusions, your premises entail anything that contradicts something I believe, then I'm just going to reject one of the premises. And in fact, if the conclusion is something I disagree with, then somewhere there's going to be a premise that entails something that I disagree with. So once I find that, I'm just going to say, well, like MJ's done here, I disagree with that. And then, well, what do, right? What seems to happen is we argue about who has the burden of proof, which is, I think, a pointless discussion. What we should be doing, in my opinion, is advancing our competing views, which try to account for the phenomena, our theories, worldviews, models, whatever you want to call them, assessing them for their explanatory merits and their virtues, and try to compare them on that basis, and try to understand competing views as well as we can, and give our best arguments as to why we think our views, our models, our theories, better exemplify the theoretical explanatory virtues in comparison to competing views. That's where we should be at. Not, I think, giving deductive arguments, which, as MJ said, always will have premises that can be rejected by people who disagree, and get us into these, I think, interminable and kind of pointless arguments about who has the burden of proof.
To make sense. So, in summary, I think there are good reasons, not decisive, but at least plausible enough reasons to think that causality, quite plausibly, is a relationship between spatiotemporal events. And therefore, there's no reason, well, not only is there no reason to think, it doesn't even make sense to ask what is the cause of the first event. It can't have a cause by the nature of what causes are.
It sounds like Fodor is tacitly assuming that if we accept his theory of causation, then to ask what caused the first event would be an illicit question. That's a big if.
Wait, it's not if I say if, that's not tacit, right? That's explicit. If this, then this. And that's the whole point of the question I asked Craig. You can't say that I'm tacitly assuming something if I make it explicit. Then I'm explicitly assuming if this view is true, then this follows. And MJ seems to agree with that. Then MJ responds by saying that's a big if, but that's a dodge, right? That's what Craig said. Well, why think that? MJ didn't dodge the question because he actually answered it, but now he's sort of retreating to what Craig said, which is just, well, why accept that view? Well, hang on. Can we at least establish what consequences the view would have for Craig's argument? Right, that was the point of the question, to illustrate that I think it has negative consequences for Craig's argument for those who accept this view. I gave two illustrative reasons for why you might think this sort of view. MJ seemed to agree with those reasons and think that they're good arguments, but just say, yeah, but there's more to causation than that. If I was going to use a burden of proof argument, I would say, well, what's his reason for thinking that there's more to causation than what's been established, right? But, obviously you're going to have different views depending on your commitments. And then the discussion keeps moving. It feels like MJ wants to move the discussion back and just say, well, that's a big if, why should we even talk about that? Earlier in the discussion, MJ said he wanted to get to the first order reasons. And then I gave some, and he seems to then retreat to just saying, well, I disagree. Like, well, why accept your view?
Want an argument. All he said is the standard view. He cited some things and causation with physics. And all that doesn't do anything.
Oh, come on. No, that's not fair. I did say it was, I said part of it was a standard view. That's the event causation. Process views of causation are not a standard view. They're a competing view. And it's not fair to just wave off what I said. I gave two specific reasons in favor of it. One was that it seems, from an analysis of the types of cases we deploy the notion of causation, like think about the Brutus killing Caesar case, that causes and effects are imminent, meaning that they seem to be very much like spatiotemporal events. That's in sort of the first indicative reason. The second indicative reason was to look at process theories of causation as a reductive understanding of causation as the transmission of conserved quantities, which seems to fit reasonably well with findings from physics. Neither of those are like deductive arguments or anything, but the two considerations that I think act in favor of this sort of view, right? They're put forward as topics for discussion. Let's talk about them. I don't think it's sufficient to just wave away what I said by just saying I quoted some stuff. I don't think that's at all fair.
What Craig said in the Q&A article, where he's open to causation being a relationship between events, not necessarily spatiotemporal events. Why has it got to be a relationship between spatiotemporal events? Why has that got to be metaphysically necessary?
I didn't say it was metaphysically necessary, and I gave a reason why. I gave two reasons why. Not deductive arguments, right? But considerations in favor. I prefer to phrase it that way.
Certain level of description after t equals 0, and you got a world, you got space and time, that on a certain level of description, maybe it is a relationship between spatiotemporal events. But at the more fundamental description, it's a relationship between patients and agents. I mean, you got to take into account all these nuances. So I don't think anything Fodor has said has undermined anything Craig has said in this domain.
According to this view. And Craig's...
But you do, though, because you said that if we hold this causal view of this particular view of causation, then that does undermine what Craig has said. You just say that MJ has said that I haven't given reasons to think that, even though I gave two reasons, which he seemed to agree with. I'm not saying definitive, again, considerations in favor. So it almost, again, this is what I said before. It's almost like MJ is agreeing with everything I say, but then disagreeing. I'm struggling to understand what the basis of his objection is, other than his disagreeing that Craig has a burden of proof to make those arguments. And I'll just concede that and say, okay, he doesn't have the burden of proof if you want to say it that way, but I think he has reasons, like epistemically and discursively, to engage in this. And I've invited him to specifically, like that was the question, right? And he declined. He just said, why think that that's true? He declined to actually engage with the discussion. That's the basis of my criticism.
Craig has given no reason to refute that. All he said is that he can't think of any reasons why you might think that. Well, I've just given a few. And if Craig was even moderately familiar with this, I assume that he would at least know of these theories of causation. And
okay, that just conflates that distinction I brought up earlier. Either Craig is saying he's not aware of a reason in the sense that, I can't think of a reason. I have no idea what the reason is, which is probably not the case. Or he means he can't think of a good and persuasive reason for the view, an argument for the view that has sufficiently persuaded him to give up premise one.
Well, that's not what he said. So Craig said, I can't think of any reason why he would hold that. He didn't say, I'm not persuaded by the reasons. If that's what he wanted to say, why not just say that? Are we trying to communicate honestly and clearly, or are we engaging in a game of rhetoric, right? Like, because if you really wanted to say, look, obviously there are reasons that people have discussed in literature, I don't find them persuasive. I mean, atheists do as well. They say there's no reason to believe in God. I think that's, I've been on record. I think that's not a good way to phrase it. What you should say is you don't think there are any good reasons for believing in God. And even that, you could probably do better and say, look, people have given reasons. I don't think the arguments are very good. I think that's better because you acknowledge that, look, there's people who give reasons and arguments, and then you also state your view on the matter. And you leave that open for further discussion. If you say, look, there's just no reason for thinking that, you're kind of closing it off for discussion. Like, well, you're kind of implying in terms of the norms of discourse that there's nothing that the other person can say because you've kind of precluded that. And that is, I think, that is the effect of Craig saying what he said. And I think that's why he said it. That's precisely why he said it. I'm not saying Craig is somehow unaware of this. My argument, I didn't say this in the video, but I would say Craig is very aware of the implications of what he said. That if you say that you can't think of any reasons why you would think this, that the implication is that there aren't any, and that there's no serious discussion to be had on it. And the reason that Craig said it is precisely to make that implication, to avoid actually having the discussion. That's my cynical take on why Craig said it. So this alternate interpretation that Craig actually really does think that there are reasons that could be discussed, and serious people have considered, but instead he said something entirely different to that. I just don't accept that as an interpretation. I think it's much more reasonable to say, look, Craig chose his words deliberately, and he made the implication precisely because that's what he wanted to imply, that there is no reasonable discussion about this.
Right. I mean, aren't those two different ways to construe that locution? I don't know. What's the more charitable interpretation? So if voter's not...
I agree. My view is not as charitable, but I've said before, I don't feel the need to be intellectually charitable towards Craig, well, more than a sort of baseline, right? So if there's two interpretations like that, I mean, I think there's more to be said in favor of my view. But look, that's not even the main point here. I just wanted to explain why I think it's quite reasonable to say that is what Craig meant, because that is what he said.
Convinced by Craig, right? So in a sense, he doesn't see a reason to think that what Craig's saying is true. But in another sense, there are reasons Craig has proposed for why he thinks that what he's saying is true, right? So there's two different ways to construe this. I don't know.
Yeah, but one is sloppy and the other is...
I don't like this point.
Yeah,
it's
fair enough. Right, yeah, let's move on.
With all due respect.
And have something to say about them. So it's a little surprising to me that he doesn't even make an attemp to refute them or say anything about them.
Come on, James.
Okay, so that was all in response to the idea that if...
Why didn't he make an attempt to refute them or respond to them? Why not? If he thinks they're good arguments, why not mention them? He could have even taken 30 seconds. He took 0 seconds. He went straight on to the point about why can't the universe have come into being without a cause, where he has stock standard talking points, and he went through those, right? Which is useless because I already know those. Why couldn't he have said something novel and interesting about metaphysics of causation? That would have been, I would have learned from it. We could have progressed the discussion, but he chose not to say that. Why? Why did he say what he said?
Causality is a relationship between spatial temporal events, then how can the first event have a cause? So as I said, I think there's a good reasons, plausible at least reasons to think that is something like what causes are, and Craig hasn't said anything in refutation of that. Indeed, he seems to have admitted tacitly that would be a problem for his theory, and given no reason for refuting the theory that I've outlined. Now, let's come back to the reasons that Craig gave in favor of the causal principle. And again, we did discuss these in the video.
The part he went over is what I was interested in. If he's going to go over these 3 reasons, I got to go to bed, because I've already gone over this in previous videos, but let me just see what's going on. So he's going into a different, let me see something. He puts these, responding to the causal principle. Why this matters for the Kalam, no, and okay.
First, let me put us. This isn't doing anything. Oh, there we go. So the first one that Craig mentioned is, how did you describe it? A basic metaphysical principle or something along those lines, that being only comes from being, not non-being. And he's described this in different ways, but I fail to see how that's not entirely question begging. Saying that being only comes from being appears to be basically just saying that everything that begins has a cause, but that's precisely what's being disputed if someone is not, as I'm not persuaded by the causal principle. So I don't actually...
But he said he didn't want to respond to this. I just want, because there's not much of the video left. I don't necessarily want to get into the causal principle here, because the point I wanted to address was the metaphysics of causation. But let me just see what he...
See how that's...
So the metaphysics involved with that principle, okay, predate considerations of causality in the context of the Kalam, as it's been published about since the 70s. So what Craig is doing here is he's appealing to a metaphysical principle which has been held by the vast majority of metaphysicians since the Middle Ages, since probably Aristotle.
Oh, dear. Is that a second order argument, the type of argument that you don't like? Well, that MJ doesn't like. Maybe he's going to clarify.
And so this principle has deep and abiding prima facie justification. And the onus is on anybody who would think that it's remotely possible for something to come from non-being. It doesn't make conceptual sense. So some principles are just so part of the fundamental framework and furniture of your reality that are so constitutive of the hinges on the door of your philosophical methodology that you can't go really any deeper.
Yes, and I think that's the problem with apologetics, because they place God in that position, right? And they just kind of, I'm not saying this is necessarily true of MJ, but I think it's true of Craig. They just can't even imagine what people who don't believe in God think about these things. And for a long time, that was true of God in the Western tradition, since the Christian Revolution, right, when they took over everything. What do you say about the hinges of the thoughts or whatever, that God was there, and people just couldn't imagine how anything could work without God, right? I find that a very weak reason. And it's particularly bizarre that he's appealing to this when previously he said that second order considerations, like the number of people who believe something and how well entrenched it is not persuasive. That seems like a pretty strong tension there to me. What I would say, by the way, I said I take that seriously. I do take that seriously, right? I would say today, the notion that being doesn't come from non-being, or everything that everything that begins to exist as a cause, that is not taken as obvious. It's basically just people like Craig who are saying that it's super obvious. In the academy, it's widely disputed, as you see with the disputation of people like Wes Morrison and Oppie and others whose name I forget, who've discussed with Craig about this. So contemporarily, I'd say that this is a disputed point, and I think Craig is on the losing side of this. Obviously, that's my opinion, right? But the point is that because people if we don't think that intelligent people disagreeing in the present is a good reason for like moderating to their view, why would we think that people disagreeing in the past who didn't have access to the same information that we have is a good reason? That strikes me as especially strange.
Any view or argument which would dispute that metaphysical principle, I would bet, would have less plausibility than the principle itself.
Well, obviously, there's going to be a clash of intuitions there. Well, let's have the discussion, right?
Because this
let's
view
have
of
the
causation,
discussion.
where he says, well, to ask where the universe came from, if causation is a relationship between spatio-temporal events, if we take that view, then it just doesn't make sense to ask the question.
Yes.
Well, okay, then the first event, if there's no God and all that, there's no north of the North Pole and all that stuff, you don't have a case where something comes from nothing or being comes from non-being. So the principle is still true. So now the question is just to back up now and say, okay, which theory of causation do we apply to the first event or the first instance of a...
I don't think it makes a lot of sense to say the theory is true when it's sort of a vacuous claim. I don't think that being comes from anything. I just will reject that sort of conception of the term. But obviously we could spend a lot of time talking about that. But MJ's initial claim was that some things are so fundamental that you just can't question them. Well, I think you absolutely can. I mean, I don't think you should have any views that are so fundamental you can't question them. I think that's dogmatic and an abdication of reason. Even 1 + 1 = 2 is a view that, I think you should sit and muse about in the evenings, right? But, people like Russell, who were pushing the foundations of mathematics, were sort of coming to grips with these sorts of issues, right? So the point is, I don't think anything should be off the table. And saying that some things are so fundamental that you can't question them sounds like dogma to me, and I strongly object to that. Some things may take a lot of evidence to overcome, right? But I actually don't think that these sort of metaphysical conjectures are actually that sort of thing, but that's another question. But yeah, you should question everything. You should be able to question everything.
Okay. So premise 1 still goes through whatever begins to exist as a cause. And okay, well, what's your theory of causation? What do you mean by cause? Okay, when we go to the first event, we can't go with Voder's theory. Generally speaking, when we talk about the plausibility of the causal premise, it's rooted in that metaphysical principle. Being is going to come from being. Nothing comes from non-being.
Yeah, being comes from being isn't the same as saying that everything that begins to exist has a cause, right? So if you say that everything begins to exist as a cause, and I say, well, why do you think that? And you say being comes from being, and being doesn't come from non-being. I'm like, well, I'm not sure what that means. But if you mean by that everything that begins to exist has a cause, then I'm like, not necessarily. If you mean something else, well, I'm not sure what you do mean. What do you mean being coming from things? I mean, we start talking about philosophy of time there. We start talking about ontology, mereology. All these issues come up, right? And they become relevant. I'm not going to be persuaded. I don't think too many people will be persuaded by it. Well, it's just a basic principle. I don't think there's any such thing as basic metaphysical principles. Everything's up for grabs in metaphysics. There are standard views, there are standard conceptions of things, and you generally want to work within those frameworks. But in terms of like fundamental principles that just can't be objected to, no, I disagree with that. There is no such thing. I think in a post-Enlightenment world, we can't abide the idea that some things just can't be questioned. I'd like to think we move beyond that notion.
I mean, I don't understand what's more obvious than that. Any other objection or view would be less obvious than that principle.
Well, why is it so obvious? Look, I don't want to get into that now. It will take us well beyond that. I don't understand why people think that they have such clear insight into the fundamental nature of reality. I mean, this is like a Humean point, right? Where is it that you perceive the causation happening? Where is it that you see being coming from non-being? You don't perceive that. You perceive specific appearances, right? And you make inferences about what's happening behind that. So how can you say it's so obvious that those inferences must be correct? I understand that's a particular way of thinking about it, right? And I'm not expecting everyone to be persuaded by Humean reasoning there. That's a particular way of I appreciate that, right? But that's where I'm coming from it at, right? MJ's coming from it. It's so obvious you can't question. I'm coming from it that actually that's entirely non-obvious. And even if it were obvious, you should still question it. Let's talk. Let's dialogue. The problem with it's so obvious objection is that it's basically a conversation stopper, which is why I think that it's a pretty useless argument for anything, really, even if you do think it's obvious.
Anyway, almost done. Give me like 2 more minutes. I gotta go to bed. I'm gonna miss you guys. I'm gonna miss you guys so much. Let's go on. Let's hear one more thing.
The language is actually put back here because, and then it kept going, right? The question is, why did it have to come from anything? Why couldn't it have just been there? That's actually what the claim is. The claim is,
if it's always been there, then it didn't start. What do you mean by start then? See, I don't get it. Okay, if it's...
Well, start would mean exist a finite duration. Sorry, I shouldn't say duration. A finite extent in the before than direction. Well, that would be under a tense less theory of time, or a B theory, or eternalist theory of time. That would be one view to understand what it means to have always been there.
It's always been there. That doesn't contradict the principle that being doesn't come from non-being, because being was always there, right? What am I missing here? He said it started though. I mean, is he endorsing B theory of time? There's nothing north of the North Pole, or does the first
I do
event
endorse the
function
B
as like
theory, but
the front edge of a ruler and everything exists statically or something like that? That still doesn't contradict being come from not being. But then Craig's an atheist. Yeah, I don't know.
well, the thing is, I think that most people aren't going to say that being does come from non-being. That doesn't really make sense, right? The question is, what does that I'm having trouble with this. What does that metaphysical principle do for us, and in terms of understanding? And I think it just doesn't do very much, right? I think it kind of doesn't really make sense. Doesn't really tell us much of anything. Oh, excuse me. So it's more like, well, being doesn't come from non-being, I guess. But does that mean the universe had to begin? Had to it had to have a cause? I don't think it does.
Again, maybe I'm dumb. Maybe I'm slow. I don't see what he's saying. Pretty much everything I've seen from Nathan and Voter have been complete garbage.
Wow, that was rude.
Anyway, because I'm dumb. I'm a dummy. It hasn't really been persuasive to me at all. And if I was, at dinner with Craig and we were watching this video together, it'd be pretty easy to answer.
But you weren't.
No offense.
Isn't that the universe came from nothing, as Craig sometimes says, nor that it popped into being, because that language implies.
The language is metaphorical, James. It's metaphorical. Popping. Sean Carroll has popophobia. Like all it means is coming from, cause to be. Popping. It's a metaphor. It's an audible metaphor or whatever.
Yeah, but that's the problem, right? Because metaphors can be misleading. And that's the criticism that I've made and that others have made about this language. I think it is incredibly misleading. There's no popping from anything, right? There's nothing to come from. It just existed at the first moment of time. Obviously, that's when it started, right? And there was no cause. That's the claim. The claim is at the first moment of time, the universe there was no cause for it. That's the claim. As soon as you start saying popping, I'm like, hang on. There's no pops here. There's no from anything. There's no popping from. There's no into. There's that doesn't apply. The metaphor is misleading. It's absolutely legitimate to criticize a metaphor if the metaphor is misleading. And that's precisely the claim here. It's not enough to just say, oh, it's a metaphor. It's a lousy metaphor. And I think Craig uses it precisely because it's rhetorically effective. Again, there's my cynicism coming. I think he uses it for a reason. I don't think you can rigorously philosophically defend the use of that metaphor in defending this claim, because the people who disagree with the causal principle, that everything that begins with have a cause, don't think that the universe popped into being. And Craig, I don't think really establishes that you have to think of it that way. He just insists on using the language. When people press him on the language, he usually resorts to saying, well, it's a metaphor, or it's a way of illustrative way of talking. I think it's a misleading way of talking that's deliberately done for rhetorical effect.
Or it's a metaphor. Don't take it so literally. Don't make metaphysical arguments on the basis of this metaphorical usage of cause to be.
But that's what Craig is doing. He's making metaphysical arguments using this metaphor. That's precisely my criticism. Again, he's agreeing with me. I'm saying, don't do this, Craig. Don't use metaphors like this to draw metaphysical principles. Let's be clear and precise about what's actually being said. And MJ agrees. So why am I in the wrong for then insisting that Craig should not draw these metaphysical conclusions based on metaphors? Oh dear.
Coming from, or I don't know. All that is temporal language, so it's inevitably metaphorical.
Exactly. Yes, that's the precise problem.
Being cannot come from not being. It just can't do it. It's impossible. That is impossible. I can't think of anything more obvious than that.
I said there was sort of nothing, and then
that's an argument for incredulity. I love the people with PhDs and fallacies. All right, I'm gonna call it a night. Fodor has not impressed me. He seems like a nice guy. He's probably really awesome at engineering, but when it comes to philosophy, the dude is actually pretty good. I'm just kidding. I just disagree. But you guys are awesome. Any last words before I disappear for a month?
Where does he get the idea that I'm
I might check
an engineer
in with my phone to say hi, but no official shows for like another month. He's probably telling that universe may have been finite, but never began to exist because there was never a time when the universe, right? So it has a front edge, and the rest of the universe exists statically, I suppose. Yeah, but it's still not a contradiction to the principle that being can come from not being. That's the thing. All right.
The question is the relevance of that principle.
You like that?
All right. I think I ended up with more of that. I think that video was better than I thought, although I obviously disagree with a lot of what was said. There was some useful responses there. I think that, again, I think that my language about Craig having a burden of proof was a bit strong. I think that was the main lesson I took from this. Let me just try to think of what else was discussed. I think that the fundamental point about my asking Craig about different theories of causation and what he would say to them, and Craig dodging that question was sound. And MJ seemed to agree with most of what I said about that, and most of what I had to say in favor of views about the spatiotemporal ladder of causation, and just kept repeating that, well, Craig and he would have different views on this, which obviously I understand, right? But then the point is, where do we go from the discourse? If Craig wants to convince people, if he wants to, present an argument that's going to be robust to different viewpoints, I think that it's behooves him to have something to say to this viewpoint, which is a standard viewpoint. It doesn't follow from that he has to respond to every conceivable viewpoint, but certainly the main ones, the ones that are standardly held, I think that would be make a lot of sense to respond to that. So All right, that was good. I think that was a good use of time there to respond to that. There is one other thing that I want to look at. I had a third, but it's going to be too late for that. But this is a shorter one, and this is not a direct response to me. Can I actually do this? Is that going to work? Yeah.
So
this is something that was sent to me by a listener who thought it might be interesting to respond to this excerpt from a discussion that Cosmic Skeptic had with Craig earlier this year. And I think the reason that they indicated, I'm sorry if I can't remember the person's name. I think the reason that they suggest that I respond to this is because this is supposed to be, or this was taken by some to be a gotcha moment or something of Cosmic Skeptic. So I've watched this, but I can't quite remember exactly what everything that's said. But this is a question about the nature of the causes of the universe. So it relates to what we were just talking about, the causal principle. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, right? Well, why think that? So let's walk through this and see what I think about Cosmic Skeptics, because I think Cosmic Skeptic makes a good point, maybe not in quite as good a way as I would have said it. I mean, obviously, I think that I would say it better, right? But I think that you can formulate the question a little better than Cosmic Skeptic does, or the point. I think it's a good point, though. As usual, I think that Craig's response is lacking, but let's have a look and see what we think of this. It's just a short clip here. What's the speed on? Yeah.
The kind of other justification that you might give, and the one that I found really interesting, was saying, if things can come into existence out of nothing, that is, if you deny the first premise, then why doesn't it happen all the time, right? Why don't things begin to exist out of nothing all the time? Now, my first thought was to say, how do we know that they don't, right? Because to come into being out of nothing would surely imply coming into existence not within the universe, because everything in the universe is not nothing, as we've said. And so to come into being out of nothing, it would have to somehow come into being outside of the universe, and therefore we wouldn't observe it. So maybe it is happening all the time, but we wouldn't be able to observe it by definition.
Here, I think you're making the same mistake that we talked about earlier when you spoke of the horse coming into being in the living room.
Yeah.
Thinking that therefore it's not out of nothing. And what I explained there was that I'm saying without an efficient cause. That's what I mean by out of nothing. So if things could come into being without an efficient cause, it seems...
So right there, I want to say that without an efficient cause is in no way similar to from nothing, right? Think about the preposition from and when we use it. Like it's a spatial or temporal preposition, or perhaps, I guess, relating, well, I guess you can relate causes, like from a cause. Still, I think that certainly when you talk about popping into being, there's an image there of some sort of spatio-temporal relationship, or some sort of locus of the effect. So at the very best, it's misleading to use that language. And Craig says, well, actually what he means is there's just no efficient cause. Well, why not just say that, right? Why not just say it comes into being without a cause, right? Because obviously that's what people who are skeptical of his claim think, that the universe came into being without a cause. So saying that you can't come into being without a cause because you can't come into being without a cause, like that's not actually an argument. That's just question begging, right? So I think Craig reformulates in saying, you can't pop into being from nothing. But if by that he just means the thing that he's trying to establish, then that's not actually an argument or an example, right? He's just restating what he thinks. So again, I'm highlighting that I think the language is lacking there. Anyway, let's keep going.
Inexplicable why things aren't just popping into existence all around us, things of different sorts, because they don't need efficient causes to bring them into being. This was an argument that A.N. Pryor developed, and I found it just completely convincing.
So let me, how can I put this?
As a general point, I would suggest that people should always be suspicious of arguments that they find completely convincing. It's fine to find an argument convincing or even very convincing, but if you find it completely convincing, then you should probably check your biases. You should probably look at other views, because that's always, I think that's a red flag, right? About that you're being, that your presuppositions or biases or prejudices or whatever are being appealed to by an argument. That's just a sort of a meta point there, but yeah, be wary of arguments that are completely convincing, including my arguments. Like, be wary of any argument that you find completely convincing.
A horse. How about an argument like this? Now, I've heard what I think might be this kind of line of argumentation from you before, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. So if someone were to say something like, and it seems absurd on the surface, but if they said something like, well, what if it's the case that universes are the only thing which can come into being out of nothing, right? A horse can't come into being out of nothing, but there's something about the universe. And we already know that the universe is a special kind of something compared to everything within the universe.
Yeah, so a name in chat that I can't read because it seems to be in Arabic says, Craig is critical of Lawrence Krauss for Krauss's use of nothing. Yeah, so I think that that's a fair criticism as well, because Lawrence Krauss has a very particular view of nothing, which is not really nothing in the philosophical sense. Yeah, that's I perfectly well accept that. I don't think that excuses Craig for similarly having, I think, misleading language. But yeah, that's a fair point.
Seems to kind of have we need to think about it in a different way.
Yeah.
Could we not say something like, well, maybe things do come into being all the time, except the only thing that come into being out of nothing is a universe, and therefore we wouldn't be able to observe it?
As A.N. Pryor said, prior to its existence, the universe doesn't exist so as to constrain what can come into being or not. So you can't say that only things of a certain kind can come into being without efficient causes, because without their causes, there just isn't anything to constrain it. So I don't think that you can say that only certain kinds of things can come into being without efficient causes.
Yeah. Now, the argument that I didn't want to put in.
So this is what Craig says, and I don't understand this. I'd really like to be able to discuss this with someone who agrees with Craig here, because I don't understand. I legitimately don't understand. I think what they're getting at, or what's persuasive to them. So let me try to articulate this right. Craig is saying that you can't say that only some things come into being without efficient causes. Why does he say that? Well, he says because nothing, like the absence of efficient causes, has no powers or properties, and so it can't constrain anything. So it can't prevent certain things from coming into being, is his argument. And therefore, if some things can come into being without a cause, then anything could, because nothing can't like be selective, essentially. Now, I find that very odd, because the way I think about, well, for want of a better word, powers, properties like causation, is that things won't come into being, or events won't happen, unless the necessary and sufficient conditions for those to occur, or for those things to come into being, pertain, right? You know, the apple won't fall off the table unless there's a force pulling it down, and then any other forces keeping it up are absent, right? That you need the conditions for something to happen. If the conditions are absent, then sort of universally the effect will not occur. Nothing needs to constrain the effect from occurring. This is critical, right? The effect just won't occur by virtue of the necessary and sufficient conditions being absent. That seems to me essentially to be the kind of built into the notion of what necessary and sufficient conditions for something to occur are. Absent those, it won't occur. In the presence of those, it will occur. And if there's necessary but not sufficient conditions, then it'll add in the sufficient conditions for it to occur, and so forth. If there's sufficient conditions, then it might happen, it might not, depends. But the point is, I don't understand this idea that there needs to be some sort of universalized constraint on what comes into being or what happens, like events that occur. That just seems bizarre to me. Things don't happen because something didn't prevent them from happening. That's what Craig seems to be thinking, that there's like a universal hand. I'm speaking metaphorically here because I'm struggling to understand, but there's like a hand that prevents everything from happening, except sometimes it lets go and allows things to happen. That's kind of the opposite to how I think about it. I think that nothing will happen anywhere at any point unless the necessary and sufficient conditions pertain for that thing to happen, right? So let's think about it. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for a horse to appear? Or like for a horse to exist, let's say. Well, you need another horse, then it gives birth to it, and then it grows up, and then it has food to eat, and blah, blah, blah. You need space and time for it to exist in for a start, right? You can't have a horse outside of space and time. It just doesn't, they aren't the sorts of things that can exist outside of space and time. Nor can you have a horse without, a horse having given birth to it. I suppose if you built a horse or something, but then that would be a different set of conditions that give rise to the horse. Right? The point is, in our universe, there are certain necessary and sufficient conditions that give rise to horses. Absent those, you never get horses, universally. In the universe or outside the universe, you'll never see them. That seems a perfectly natural way of understanding necessary and sufficient conditions to me, and the notion of causal powers. Craig seems to think about it that actually you'll always see horses and everything else unless something prevents them from coming into being. And that thing can only either prevent everything from coming into being or prevent nothing from coming into being, and then everything will just pop into being. But why would you think about things that way? Why would you think that we need some explanation of something not being prevented from coming to being? Why not just say that things only come into being if the necessary and sufficient conditions are present? The further claim, and this is what cosmic skeptics are alluding to, is that perhaps there are certain types of entities that have no necessary and sufficient conditions for their coming into being, or for the event occurring. Now, clearly horses aren't such a thing, right? Or root beers or Beethoven. Those all do have necessary and sufficient conditions for them coming to being. So they will never come into being absent those. But perhaps, just perhaps, there are certain types of events or processes or objects or substances or whatever you want to say that lack any necessary and sufficient conditions for coming into existence. And perhaps the further claim is that a universe is that sort of thing. Now, what is a universe? Well, a universe is perhaps a region of space and time. In which case, a universe of space and time can't really come into existence inside another universe of space and time, because then it would be part of that universe. That seems contradictory. So it would have to come into being somewhere that is not that existing universe, right? Otherwise, again, it would just be part of the first universe, or at least that seems reasonable. I mean, could we be sort of conjoined with a different universe that we never interact with because it has different physics? I have no idea. This is getting super speculative, right? But I guess the point is, it seems to me that there's nothing at all absurd about saying that certain types of things events, processes may lack any necessary and sufficient conditions. And so those could occur. As far as you know, they could always occur. But because they won't occur in this universe, because things in this universe do have necessary and sufficient conditions, as far as we can tell, right? So we will never observe them. As I understand it, that's the argument. Craig's response is a bizarre metaphysics of prevention, where it's like things will happen unless something prevents them from happening. I say no, nothing will happen unless the necessary and sufficient causes exist to make it happen, or at least to make it probable to happen. Maybe you think probabilistic causation. And the claim is that maybe certain things don't have any necessary and sufficient conditions. Universes coming into being may be one of those things. Now, you don't have to go all the way there. You might say there are necessary and sufficient conditions for universes coming to being, and they only pertain at certain times, right? And those no longer pertain. That's why we don't see those things coming into being. But the point is, I just do not understand Craig's metaphysics of prevention, as I'm calling it here, because I kind of like that term. Why does he think that that is a good way to think about it? Because again, it seems to me the natural way we think about things is that necessary and sufficient conditions, causes and powers, give rise to their effects, and the effects need those things to happen, right? Absent those causes or absent those prerequisites, they won't happen. Craig seems to be saying, they will happen unless something prevents them from happening. I just find that profoundly odd and don't understand why he defends that view. So I hope that that's kind of clear about why I don't understand Craig's point here. I'd really like to have a discussion with someone who thinks that Craig's spot on about this, and we could maybe nut out about where we're going different, sort of where one's going wrong and why we think differently here. Anyway, so that's my view on it. Let's see where the discussion continues.
In your mouth was one that I've heard elsewhere, where people would say the argument that the reason you can't say that only universes can come into being out of nothing is because nothing doesn't have any properties, and so therefore can't have a kind of preference for universes over other things.
Yeah.
My response to that was to say, what if the necessity of it being a universe is not a property of the nothing, but a property of the thing? And let me explain myself. For example, if we human beings create a circle, it has to be round, right? We can't create a square circle.
Right.
But that's not due to a property of us. That's due to a property of the circle, right?
Yeah.
So in the same way, although nothing has no properties and so can't prefer universes, what if only universes can come from nothing because of a property of the universe, not because of a property of nothing?
Right. Well, that is exactly what you would have.
So to phrase that in the way that I was saying, universes may plausibly be the only type of thing, or a member of a very small set, that can come into being without any antecedent conditions. Anything in the universe is not a such thing, so we don't see those things popping into being from nothing, because absent the necessary and sufficient conditions, they will never occur. They will never take place. They'll never come into being. But perhaps universes don't follow those rules, and that would be an intrinsic property of the universes, of regions of space and time with a certain law of physics or something. I think that's the claim being made here, and there seems to be no way to, I mean, in itself, right, we never observe that, right, because it would be entirely outside of our universe. There'd be no, in principle, way of observing this. So I don't usually like to make those sort of metaphysical speculations. But I guess the point here is that Craig is making the claim that universes can't just come into being without a cause. And he's making that claim on the basis of a certain understanding of how all that works. And the claim here is, well, but why should we think it works that way? Here's another way of thinking about it, which it doesn't seem that we can actually distinguish from Craig's view, other than through pretty abstruse metaphysical principles, which we can all object to. Right. So I'm not saying, I should be clear, I'm not saying that this is, the view I'm saying is it has strong reasons in favor of it. I think the metaphysics of prevention that Craig seems to be appealing to here is very strange, and I think requires some explanation as to why he accepts that. It's, at least to my view, it seems to contradict the way we typically think about causes and effects and necessary and sufficient conditions. But again, these things can be subjective, so I don't want to push that too strong. But at the very least, I think that we're at a position where, well, look, there's two different views here about how this stuff might work, and absent like clear evidence one way or the other, which we may never be possible, maybe we should withhold judgment. So that's not definitive, right? There are obviously further issues that we'll have to consider, like the nature of causation and so forth, that I think that there is more to say about. But the point is here, I just don't know how Craig is so certain that this view is wrong when it's not actually clear how you would even adjudicate which view is correct. Well, at least not on the basis of things that have been mentioned here. Like, because again, we would never observe these things, so how would you know if they're happening or not?
Have to say, because as you say, properties only inhere in existing things. Beings have properties, not non-being. So you'd have to say it's an inherent property of the universe that it can spring into existence without a cause. And I just can't make sense of that.
Which sounds absurd.
Something that doesn't exist come into existence without a cause because it has a property after it comes into existence.
Yeah,
I mean,
Yeah, so this is the problem, right? And I think that Cosmic Skeptic lets himself be kind of captured by Craig's mocking here. The claim is not that, or at least I think the best way to describe it is not that the universe, well, you get into issues here. I think the best way to describe this is not to say that the universe has a property of being able to come into being without a cause. That does sound pretty weird, right? Because how can it have that property if it doesn't exist, right? Rather, I think the way to put it would be to talk about negative properties. Now, that is controversial about the ontological status of negative properties, like the property of not having something or not being something. But putting that aside for the moment and just trying to understand the view here, at least as I think about it, and I think that as Cosmic Skeptic was thinking about it as best as I can tell, does it make sense to say that there may be types of entities, processes, events, whatever, that lack any necessary antecedent conditions or necessary and sufficient conditions? They lack a property of requiring any such things, right? Again, horse, well, clearly it requires certain things to come into being, right? Even if you somehow built one atom by atom, that would then be the necessary and sufficient conditions. Beethoven, root beer, all of these things clearly have necessary and sufficient conditions for them coming into being or for them, existing. Our universe is that sort of thing. I contend, well, for all we know, they might not be. I'm not saying that they're not. I'm saying, how do you know that they're not? We don't observe universes coming into being. We don't observe them not coming into being, and we wouldn't, right? That's the whole point. We would observe root beer and Beethoven presumably coming into being inside the universe. We don't, right? That tells us something about the causal, the way root beer and Beethoven and horses and whatever else work. But the fact that we don't observe universes coming into being when we never would under any view, it seems, doesn't tell us anything about the nature of causation, because it's consistent with multiple views, such as that they can't come into being without a cause, or that they don't need a cause to come into being and do come into being, but obviously not in our universe. No one's going to say that a new universe could come into being in our universe, because then it would be part of our universe. A universe presumably just being something like a causally disconnected region of space-time with its own laws or something like that, right? If it existed in our universe, then it wouldn't be a different universe, right? So I think that there's a conceptual notion here that means that we just could never observe them. So there's a claim here that, well, maybe universes are this sort of thing. It's not a claim that they have a property that allows them to come into being absent of cause. It's saying that they just lack any property that requires them. They lack that necessary and sufficient conditions for them to come into being. That is the claim. What evidence would we have one way or the other about the claim, like directly in terms of observations, not philosophical arguments, because there's things we can say there, but in terms of like what we observe, it doesn't seem to me we could determine either way. And so that's, I think, the point of someone like me, and I assume Cosmic Skeptic is going to say, I don't think we can know what you're saying, Craig. I don't think we can know whether universes are the sort of thing that needs a cause or not, because for all we know, they could come into being without a cause, because they just may not have that property of having necessary and sufficient conditions. So I don't understand this metaphysics of prevention, where it's like things will happen unless something prevents them from doing that. No. The whole point is that most things have necessary and sufficient conditions. Absent those, they won't happen, or they won't occur. They won't begin to exist. Universes may not be like that. Again, we can't think of universes as beginning to exist at a point in space and time. That is obviously silly, but they don't exist in space and time. They are their own space and time, right? So our intuitions are really a bit screwy here. They're not going to be that useful for us. So there's no popping into being. There's simply that there'll be a bunch of, according to the view, there'll be a bunch of universes, each of which would start at their own beginning of time and have their own spatial extent. Maybe same laws, maybe different, who knows, right? They wouldn't like come into being in the sense that they'd pop into being out of somewhere. They would just be causally disconnected aspects of reality with their own space and time, maybe their own separate laws, and they would have had no causes. What is impossible about that? I don't see the impossibility. It only becomes impossible if you imagine them popping into being somewhere, which, again, Craig seems to agree here. It's just a way of speaking, right? Once we get rid of the popping into being and understand, I think, the way that necessary and sufficient conditions work, we're going to say that, look, as far as we know, why couldn't there be causally disconnected regions of reality, all of which lack a cause? What's the contradiction about that? You don't have to say that they have a property of not requiring cause. They just lack that property of having necessary and sufficient conditions.
It sounds strange, but the reason why I think it's useful to think in those terms, or at least of the possibility of it happening, is because specifically the objection that why don't things pop into existence all the time? I suppose what I'm trying to do is make at least a far-fetched case. I'm trying to show at least a possibility that things could come into existence out of nothing, and yet by definition we be incapable of witnessing it. So maybe things do come into existence out of nothing all the time, but because these are only universes, we'll never be able to observe it. We'll never be able to see it.
Yeah, I think part of the issue here is that, probably for necessity of the conversation, Cosmic Skeptic is using the phrase "come into being out of nothing," which which I think can't work, right? Because each of these causally disconnected, isolated universes would have it, like by assumption, I mean, maybe some of them would be atemporal, right? But by assumption would have its own metric of time. So they wouldn't come into being in any sense that would, I mean, they would have a first unit of time, right? In that sense, they would, and that's, Craig is very careful. That's actually how he defines come into being if you sort of press him on it. But come into being in the ordinary sense of like, you know, not being, they're here. Obviously, that wouldn't happen, right? They would just be causally isolated, disconnected regions of space-time, possibly with the same or different laws of physics. None of them would come into being in a sense, but they would all exist absent without, and their initial moment or the totality would lack a cause. Why and how can they begin to exist without a cause, you might ask? Well, because they're not the sort of things that require a cause. They don't have any necessary and sufficient conditions for existing. They simply exist, right? That is the claim. I'm not saying that that is the case. The question, and I think that Cosmic Skeptic puts it well, what observational evidence do we have that that is not the case? It seems that it's not possible that we could have any because they would be causally disconnected regions which we'd never observe. The only way we can say anything about them is by inference. And there's different philosophical things you could say about this. You could say, well, it's less plausible to think that such things exist. But Craig says that that can't happen, right? It's impossible because it just doesn't make sense. And that's for someone like me and Cosmic Skeptics in there, right? Seems a bit strong when, how do you really know that they couldn't exist, right? Again, that's the substance of the claim. I don't think metaphysics of prevention, as Craig's saying, that things will happen unless something prevents them. I don't think that works. I don't think it makes sense as a response.
Let me commend you for your method, Alex, because by pushing these questions, what you help the atheist to see is the intellectual price tag
Yes.
of his atheism. And I think that's very valuable. One of the goals of the Christian apologist will be to try to raise the intellectual price tag of non-belief. And if non-belief or non-theism requires me to be a mereological nihilist, to think that things have an intrinsic property, that they can come into being, that other things don't have, this is all raising the intellectual price tag of non-belief. For me, at least, Alex, just way, way beyond what I'm willing to pay. And so that's helpful that you're doing this.
That is a really, really interesting way of thinking about apologetics and the argument that we're having. It's kind of like, what's the better deal here, right? Because both worldviews seem at least consistent, but you've got to ask yourself, how much you're willing to sacrifice of your intuitions, how much you're willing to sacrifice of the beliefs that you think are true in order to hold to those conclusions. And the key point is taking the justifications that we're giving and showing what they lead to. Right?
All right, so that concludes the clip there that I wanted to discuss. Why do I always get John Peterson clips? Oh, you can get an insight into what sort of things I watch on YouTube. It occurs to me by what I'm being recommended here. Anyway, Age of Empires fans finally buffed longswords, new meta. Anyway, but in terms of the end part of that discussion, now a number of people commented that they felt it was a very cordial discussion, and in some sense it was, right? But what Craig did there is, again, I have a cynical take on Craig, right? So this is not going to be entirely charitable, but that's the warning. What he actually did is I think extremely rude, just put it simply, because what he basically said is that, Alex, what you're doing is great. You're showing how dumb atheism is. That's basically what he said. He used the phrase raising the intellectual price tag, and then he talked about how the sort of things that you'd have to believe, to be an atheist. But effectively, with slightly polite language, he's saying, wow, you're showing everyone how silly and ridiculous atheism is. So thanks for that. You're doing a good job. and really, that's just a veiled insult as far as I can tell. Imagine if you said that to a theist, like, well, good job, Craig. You're showing people what the intellectual price tag is for, conservative evangelical Christianity. So I think that's a really important job. I would be accused of being condescending and rude and demeaning, right? Rightly so, because that would be rude. Maybe I'd be justified, but it would still be rude. So, I find that really objectionable that he said that. And just because you say something using polite language and you sound nice in your tone of voice, that doesn't mean that it's not rude. There's such a thing as passive aggressive. I don't think that was even as passive aggressive. It was just rude, but in a polite voice. Anyway, so coming back to the point of it, right? It's interesting that Craig at the end didn't want to actually defend the view that what Alex was saying, Cosmic Skeptic was saying, it didn't make sense or was illogical. He just thought that it was absurd. But that's sort of the point, right? People have different intuitions about this. So let's try to dig behind the intuitions and ask serious, deep questions about why we hold these and what reasons can be given in favor of them. The atheist or naturalist or someone like myself, and I think Alex, is concerned that Craig is being too hasty here by saying that universes require a cause. People like me and Alex think that it may well be possible for some things, such as universes, to just exist without a cause. We shouldn't be pulled into saying that they pop into being or come into being without a cause, unless that's understood very specifically as simply have a first temporal moment and that lacks a cause, right? But nothing comes into being in the sense that like it pops into being or it doesn't exist and then it does. Obviously, that doesn't make sense for a universe. But understanding is simply lacking an efficient cause. Well, how would we know if there were causally disconnected regions of reality that are other universes, other spatio-temporal extents, effectively, if that's what you think a universe is, that themselves lacked a cause? They exist entirely sort of separately from our universe, and so in that sense, they're different universes, but they also lack a cause. How would we know if that was true? Craig is saying it cannot be true because it's just absurd. And his argument for that specifically here that was being discussed is that if that were true, then anything and everything would pop into being without a cause. But that just seems wrong, right? Because that seems to assume that this metaphysics of prevention, right, where everything and everything will happen unless something prevents it from happening. But it seems to me that what Alex is saying, what I'm saying is, no, there might be certain types of things, and maybe it's even only universals or a small subset of types of things that lack any necessary and sufficient antecedent conditions for them coming into being. It's not that they have a property that they can come into being, it's that they just lack any of those. So this gets us into issues of negative properties that I mentioned. But I don't think there's anything on the face of it absurd of saying, hey, maybe there are things that don't need causes to come into being. And obviously, if there are things that can come into being without a cause, it won't be things that do need causes or that do have antecedent, necessary, and sufficient conditions, like all of the things that Craig usually mentions that would pop into being. Well, no, clearly everyone thinks that those aren't going to pop into being from nothing inside the universe. That doesn't make sense. They have necessary and sufficient conditions that bring them into being. They can't just pop into being from nothing inside the universe. The question is, are there some weird types of entities, perhaps universes, right, which aren't like that and that don't require necessary and sufficient causes? They just don't have any such things. How do you know, Craig, that there aren't such things? And we're not persuaded by appealing to a wholly different type of entity, like root beer and Beethoven and horses and whatever, not the fact that those don't pop into being within the universe. Well, of course they won't. No one thinks that they will, right? The question is, other sorts of things. Could there be other sorts of things that don't exist inside universes, that are themselves perhaps universes? Could those sorts of things exist without a cause or begin without a cause? That is the question here. And I just see it as unsatisfactory to appeal to things that no one thinks can pop into being without a cause, and that we can distinguish from what we're talking about by virtue of them existing within a universe, not being a universe. So I guess that's where we're at here. Remember, this is not an argument for it being the case that the universe doesn't have a cause. It's, I think, an undercutting defeater in the sense that it's asking seriously, look, how do you really know that this causal principle is true? Can we really be confident in that when it seems that there's no observation that we could make that would distinguish the two cases from universes must have a cause to actually they don't need one? I don't know if anyone remembers that movie Monsters vs. Aliens, but there's a giant like sentient blob of goo or something that's one of the characters, and the sort of joke is that he doesn't have a brain. And one of the characters is asking about that, and he just sort of says, yeah, I don't have a brain. Turns out you don't need one. Which, like, I think is an amusing joke because it's sort of like, doesn't explain anything about why you don't need a brain. But I think actually could be an interesting way of thinking about it in terms of like, well, do you need a cause? Maybe it just turns out you don't need one. Like, how would you know? I think is the question. Like, how would you really know if it turned out that certain things didn't need one? So anyway, maybe that's a helpful a way of thinking about it. So that is going to be it for this evening. I just noticed that there's a bit of action in chat. So let me have a quick look here. Well, I'm not sure, Nathan, what you're saying here. Silly quid pro quo. Why can't I say that? Silly quid pro quo, Alex. I know he doesn't believe any of this. I'm not sure what any of this is there. Yeah, just on Alex. So I don't think he was. I think Craig was rude, laughed at Alex's suggestions, and basically said that he was showing how stupid atheism is, and didn't seriously engage with what Alex was trying to say. He didn't seem interested in trying to understand the objection, just to make fun of it. So I'm really critical of Craig, especially because he's coming in a position of superiority, like of age and of qualifications and everything like that. So he should be more gracious, I think. But I think Alex did well. I think that he was too ready to just sort of accede to Craig's phrasing of things. And perhaps could have put things in a bit better way. But, obviously it's easy to, what they call it, Monday night quarterback or whatever. But I think he did well, and I don't think he was roasted or anything like that. I think actually just, if a rewatch that is, I guess it converts my bias, but I think Craig came across poorly, just in the way that he interacted with Alex there being just a dick, really. Let's see. Anything else that I wanted to say here? Just having a quick look through chat here. According to inspired philosophy, you don't need a brain either. Yeah, that's interesting. His views about what is it called again? Dual aspect idealism. So, oh yeah, that's not a response to what I just said. Yeah, so Elijah here is taking issue with some of what I was saying. Certain things don't need causes to come into being. There is nothing in the natural universe to provide evidence for this line of reasoning. Yeah, that's right. So that's the precise point, right? We don't have anything in the universe that would support that. We don't have anything in the universe that would support its contrary. I understand that that's the precise point being made. What we're trying to do, as I understand it, is illustrate that what we observe in the universe actually doesn't distinguish between these views, and therefore we should be a lot more cautious. We should be more agnostic about this particular point, whether universes need causes. So I don't think that it's a problem that the idea that the universe can lack a cause is not supported by anything we observe in the universe. I think that that's sort of the point of it, right? Nothing that exists in the universe, at least that we understand so far, will tell us one way or the other. And so Craig coming out very strongly and saying that it's very clear that it goes one way seems to people like me and Alex to be far too strong. That's the point of it. All right, I think that will be all for this evening. Thanks everyone for listening. Hopefully you found this interesting. I will get around to making a proper thumbnail for it. So these were two videos that people sent to me. So thanks for those who did that. I may take a while to get back, to get around to responding to things because I have to find the time when I can, but I appreciate that. And I hope people found that some of this interesting. Always open for continued dialogue on these questions. I think it's important and we should do this rigorously and also openly and honestly. Thanks everyone again. Stay safe. Talk to you soon. Bye.